Chapter 40. Wise in his daily work was he. To fruits of diligence, and not to faiths or polity, he plied his utmost sense. These perfect in their little parts, whose work is all their prize, without them how could laws, or arts, or towered cities rise? In watching effects, if only of an electric battery, it is often necessary to change our place and examine a particular mixture or group at some distance from the point where the movement we are interested in was set up. The group I am moving towards is at Caleb Garth's breakfast table in the large parlor where the maps and desk were. Father, mother, and 5 of the children. Mary was just now at home waiting for a situation, while Christy, the boy next to her, was getting cheap learning and cheap fare in Scotland, having to his father's disappointment taken to books instead of that sacred calling, business. The letters had come, 9 costly letters, for which the postman had been paid 3 and 2pence, and Mr. Garth was forgetting his tea and toast while he read his letters and laid them open one above the other, sometimes swaying his head slowly, sometimes screwing up his mouth in inward debate, but not forgetting to cut off a large red seal unbroken, which Letty snatched up like an eager terrier. The talk among the rest went on unrestrainedly, for nothing disturbed Caleb's absorption except shaking the table when he was writing. 2 letters of the 9 had been for Mary. After reading them, she had passed them to her mother, and sat playing with her teaspoon absently, till with a sudden recollection she returned to her sewing, which she had kept on her lap during breakfast. "Oh, don't sew, Mary," said Ben, pulling her arm down. "Make me a peacock with this bread crumb." He had been kneading a small mass for the purpose. "No, no, mischief," said Mary, good-humoredly, while she pricked his hand lightly with her needle. "Try and mold it yourself. You have seen me do it often enough. I must get this sewing done. It is for Rosamond Vincy. She is to be married next week, and she can't be married without this handkerchief." Mary ended merrily, amused with the last notion. "Why can't she, Mary?" said Letty, seriously interested in this mystery, and pushing her head so close to her sister that Mary now turned the threatening needle towards Letty's nose. "Because this is one of a dozen, and without it there would only be 11, said Mary, with a grave air of explanation, so that Letty sank back with a sense of knowledge. "Have you made up your mind, my dear?" said Mrs. Garth, laying the letters down. "I shall go to the school at York," said Mary. "I am less unfit to teach in a school than in a family. I like to teach classes best, and, you see, I must teach. There is nothing else to be done. Teaching seems to me the most delightful work in the world," said Mrs. Garth, with a touch of rebuke in her tone. "I could understand your objection to it if you had not knowledge enough, Mary, or if you disliked children. I suppose we never quite understand why another dislikes what we like, mother," said Mary, rather curtly. "I am not fond of a schoolroom. I like the outside world better. It is a very inconvenient fault of mine." "It must be very stupid to be always in a girls' school," said Alfred. "Such a set of nincompoops, like Mrs. Ballard's pupils walking 2 and 2. And they have no games worth playing at," said Jim. "They can neither throw nor leap. I don't wonder at Mary's not liking it." "What is that Mary doesn't like, eh?" said the father, looking over his spectacles, and pausing before he opened his next letter. "Being among a lot of nincompoop girls," said Alfred. "Is it the situation you had heard of, Mary?" said Caleb, gently, looking at his daughter. "Yes, father, the school at York. I have determined to take it. It is quite the best, £35 a year, and extra pay for teaching the smallest strummers at the piano. Poor child, I wish she could stay at home with us, Susan," said Caleb, looking plaintively at his wife. "Mary would not be happy without doing her duty," said Mrs. Garth, magisterially, conscious of having done her own. "It wouldn't make me happy to do such a nasty duty as that," said Alfred, at which Mary and her father laughed silently, but Mrs. Garth said, gravely, "Do find a fitter word than nasty, my dear Alfred, for everything that you think disagreeable. And suppose that Mary could help you to go to Mr. Hammer's with the money she gets. That seems to me a great shame. But she's an old brick, said Alfred, rising from his chair and pulling Mary's head backward to kiss her. Mary colored and laughed, but could not conceal that the tears were coming. Caleb, looking on over his spectacles, with the angles of his eyebrows falling, had an expression of mingled delight and sorrow as he returned to the opening of his letter, an evening Mrs. Garth, her lips curling with a calm contentment, allowed that inappropriate language to pass without correction, although Ben immediately took it up and sang, "She's an old brick, old brick, old brick," to a cantering measure, which he beat out with his fist on Mary's arm. But Mrs. Garth's eyes were now drawn towards her husband, who was already deep in the letter he was reading. His face had an expression of grave surprise, which alarmed her a little, but he did not like to be questioned while he was reading, and she remained anxiously watching till she saw him suddenly shaken by a little joyous laugh as he turned back to the beginning of the letter, and looking at her above his spectacles, said, in a low tone, "What do you think, Susan?" She went and stood behind him, putting her hand on his shoulder, while they read the letter together. It was from Sir James Chettam, offering to Mr. Garth the management of the family estates at Freshitt and elsewhere, and adding that Sir James had been requested by Mr. Brooke of Tipton to ascertain whether Mr. Garth would be disposed at the same time to resume the agency of the Tipton property. The baronet added in very obliging words that he himself was particularly desirous of seeing the Freshitt and Tipton estates under the same management, and he hoped to be able to show that the double agency may be held on terms agreeable to Mr. Garth, whom he would be glad to see at the Hall at 12 o'clock on the following day. "He writes handsomely, doesn't he, Susan?" said Caleb, turning his eyes upward to his wife, who raised her hand from his shoulder to his ear, while she rested her chin on his head. "Brooke didn't like to ask me himself, I can see," he continued, laughing silently. "Here is an honor to your father, children," said Mrs. Garth, looking round at the 5 pair of eyes, all fixed on the parents. "He is asked to take a post again by those who dismissed him long ago. That shows that he did his work well, so that they feel the want of him." "Like Cincinnatus, Core," said Ben, riding on his chair, with a pleasant confidence that discipline was relaxed. "Will they come to fetch him, mother?" said Letty, thinking of the mayor and corporation in their robes. Mrs. Garth patted Letty's head and smiled, but seeing that her husband was gathering up his letters and likely soon to be out of reach in that sanctuary business, she pressed his shoulder and said emphatically, "Now, mind you ask fair pay, Caleb." "Oh yes," said Caleb, in a deep voice of assent, as if it would be unreasonable to suppose anything else of him. "It'll come to between 400 and 500, the two together." Then, with a little start of remembrance, he said, "Mary, write and give up that school. Stay and help your mother. I'm as pleased as Punch, now I've thought of that." No manner could have been less like that of Punch triumphant than Caleb's, but his talents did not lie in finding phrases, though he was very particular about his letter writing, and regarded his wife as a treasury of correct language. There was almost an uproar among the children now, and Mary held up the cambric embroidery towards her mother entreatingly, that it may be put out of reach, while the boys dragged her into a dance. Mrs. Garth, in placid joy, began to put the cups and plates together, while Caleb, pushing his chair from the table, as if he were going to move to the desk, still sat holding his letters in his hand and looking on the ground meditatively, stretching out the fingers of his left hand according to a mute language of his own. At last he said, "It's 1,000 pities Christy didn't take to business, Susan. I shall want help by and by, and Alfred must go off to the engineering. I've made up my mind to that." He fell into meditation and finger rhetoric again for a little while, and then continued, "I shall make Brooke have new agreements with the tenants, and I shall draw up a rotation of crops. And I'll lay a wager we can get fine bricks out of the clay at Bott's Corner. I must look into that, it would cheapen the repairs. It's a fine bit of work, Susan. A man without a family would be glad to do it for nothing." "Mind you don't, though," said his wife, lifting up her finger. "No, no. but it's a fine thing to come to a man when he's seen into the nature of business, to have the chance of getting a bit of the country into good fettle, as they say, and putting men into the right way with their farming, and getting a bit of good contriving and solid building done, that those who are living and those who come after will be the better for. I'd sooner have it than a fortune. I hold it the most honorable work that is. Here Caleb laid down his letters, thrust his fingers between the buttons of his waistcoat, and sat upright, but soon proceeded with some awe in his voice and moving his head slowly aside. It's a great gift of God, Susan. That it is, Caleb, said his wife, with answering fervor, and it will be a blessing to your children to have had a father who did such work, a father whose good work remains though his name may be forgotten. She could not say any more to him then about the pay. In the evening, when Caleb, rather tired with his day's work, was seated in silence with his pocket-book open on his knee, while Mrs. Garth and Mary were at their sewing, and Letty in a corner was whispering a dialogue with her doll, Mr. Fairbrother came up the orchard walk, dividing the bright August lights and shadows with the tufted grass and the apple-tree boughs. We know that he was fond of his parishioners the Garths, and had thought Mary worth mentioning to Lydgate. He used to the full the clergyman's privilege of disregarding the Middlemarch discrimination of ranks, and always told his mother that Mrs. Garth was more of a lady than any matron in the town. Still, you see, he spent his evenings at the Vinceys, where the matron, though less of a lady, presided over a well-lit drawing-room and whist. In those days human intercourse was not determined solely by respect, but the vicar did heartily respect the Garths, and a visit from him was no surprise to that family. Nevertheless, he accounted for it evening while he was shaking hands, by saying, I come as an envoy, Mrs. Garth. I have something to say to you and Garth on behalf of Fred Vincey. The fact is, poor fellow, he continued, as he seated himself and looked round with his bright glance at the three who were listening to him, he has taken me into his confidence. Mary's heart beat rather quickly. She wondered how far Fred's confidence had gone. We haven't seen the lad for months, said Caleb. I couldn't think what was become of him. He has been away on a visit, said the vicar, because home was a little too hot for him, and Lydgate told his mother that the poor fellow must not begin to study yet. But yesterday he came and poured himself out to me. I am very glad he did, because I have seen him grow up from a youngster of 14, and I am so much at home in the house that the children are like nephews and nieces to me. But it is a difficult case to advise upon. However, he has asked me to come and tell you that he is going away, and that he is so miserable about his debt to you, and his inability to pay, that he can't bear to come himself evening to bid you good-bye. Tell him it doesn't signify a farthing, said Caleb, waving his hand. We've had the pinch and have got over it, and now I'm going to be as rich as a Jew. Which means, said Mrs. Garth, smiling at the vicar, that we are going to have enough to bring up the boys well and to keep Mary at home. What is the treasure trove? Said Mr. Fairbrother. I'm going to be agent for 2 estates, Freshitt and Tipton, and perhaps for a pretty little bit of land in Lowick besides. It's all the same family connection, and employment spreads like water if it's once set going. It makes me very happy, Mr. Fairbrother. Here Caleb threw back his head a little, and spread his arms on the elbows of his chair, that I've got an opportunity again with the letting of the land and carrying out a notion or two with improvements. It's a most uncommonly cramping thing, as I've often told Susan, to sit on horseback and look over the hedges at the wrong thing, and not be able to put your hand to it to make it right. What people do who go into politics I can't think. It drives me almost mad to see mismanagement over only a few hundred acres. It was seldom that Caleb volunteered so long a speech, but his happiness had the effect of mountain air. His eyes were bright, and the words came without effort. I congratulate you heartily, Garth, said the vicar. This is the best sort of news I could have had to carry to Fred Vincey, for he dwelt a good deal on the injury he had done you in causing you to part with money, robbing you of it, he said, which you wanted for other purposes. I wish Fred were not such an idle dog. He has some very good points, and his father is a little hard upon him. Where is he going? Said Mrs. Garth, rather coldly. He means to try again for his degree, and he is going up to study before term. I have advised him to do that. I don't urge him to enter the church, on the contrary, but if he will go and work so as to pass, that will be some guarantee that he has energy and a will, and he is quite at sea. He doesn't know what else to do. So far he will please his father, and I have promised in the meantime to try and reconcile Vincy to his son's adopting some other line of life. Fred says frankly he is not fit for a clergyman, and I would do anything I could to hinder a man from the fatal step of choosing the wrong profession. He quoted to me what you said, Miss Garth. Do you remember it? Mr. Fairbrother used to say Mary instead of Miss Garth, but it was part of his delicacy to treat her with the more deference because, according to Mrs. Vincy's phrase, she worked for her bread. Mary felt uncomfortable, but, determined to take the matter lightly, answered at once, I have said so many impertinent things to Fred, we are such old playfellows. You said, according to him, that he would be one of those ridiculous clergymen who help to make the whole clergy ridiculous. Really, that was so cutting that I felt a little cut myself. Caleb laughed. She gets her tongue from you, Susan, he said, with some enjoyment. Not its flippancy, father, said Mary, quickly, fearing that her mother would be displeased. It is rather too bad of Fred to repeat my flippant speeches to Mr. Fairbrother. It was certainly a hasty speech, my dear, said Mrs. Garth, with whom speaking evil of dignities was a high misdemeanor. We should not value our vicar the less because there was a ridiculous curate in the next parish. There's something in what she says, though, said Caleb, not disposed to have Mary's sharpness undervalued. A bad workman of any sort makes his fellows mistrusted. Things hang together, he added, looking on the floor and moving his feet uneasily with a sense that words were scantier than thoughts. Clearly, said the vicar, amused. By being contemptible we set men's minds to the tune of contempt. I certainly agree with Miss Garth's view of the matter, whether I am condemned by it or not. But as to Fred Vincy, it is only fair he should be excused a little. Old Featherstone's delusive behavior did help to spoil him. There was something quite diabolical in not leaving him a farthing after all. But Fred has the good taste not to dwell on that. And what he cares most about is having offended you, Mrs. Garth. He supposes you will never think well of him again. I have been disappointed in Fred, said Mrs. Garth, with decision, but I shall be ready to think well of him again when he gives me good reason to do so. At this point Mary went out of the room, taking Letty with her. Oh, we must forgive young people when they are sorry, said Caleb, watching Mary close the door. And as you say, Mr. Fairbrother, there was the very devil in that old man. Now Mary's gone out. I must tell you a thing, it's only known to Susan and me, and you'll not tell it again. The old scoundrel wanted Mary to burn one of the wills the very night he died, when she was sitting up with him by herself, and he'd offered her a sum of money that he had in the box by him if she would do it. But Mary, you understand, could do no such thing, would not be handling his iron chest, and so on. Now, you see, the will he wanted burnt was this last, so that if Mary had done what he wanted, Fred Vincy would have had £10,000. The old man did turn to him at the last. That touches poor Mary close, she couldn't help it. She was in the right to do what she did, but she feels, as she says, much as if she had knocked down somebody's property and broken it against her will, when she was rightfully defending herself. I feel with her, somehow, and if I could make any amends to the poor lad, instead of bearing him a grudge for the harm he did us, I should be glad to do it. Now, what is your opinion, sir? Susan doesn't agree with me. She says, tell what you say, Susan. Mary could not have acted otherwise, evening if she had known what would be the effect on Fred, said Mrs. Garth, pausing from her work, and looking at Mr. Fairbrother. and she was quite ignorant of it. It seems to me a loss which falls on another because we have done right is not to lie upon our conscience. The vicar did not answer immediately, and Caleb said, "It's the feeling. The child feels in that way, and I feel with her. You don't mean your horse to tread on a dog when you're backing out of the way, but it goes through you when it's done. I am sure Mrs. Garth would agree with you there," said Mr. Fairbrother, who for some reason seemed more inclined to ruminate than to speak. "One could hardly say that the feeling you mention about Fred is wrong, or rather, mistaken, though no man ought to make a claim on such feeling." "Well, well," said Caleb, "it's a secret. You will not tell Fred?" "Certainly not. But I shall carry the other good news that you can afford the loss he caused you." Mr. Fairbrother left the house soon after, and seeing Mary in the orchard with Letty, went to say good-bye to her. They made a pretty picture in the western light, which brought out the brightness of the apples on the old scant-leaved boughs, Mary in her lavender gingham and black ribbons holding a basket, while Letty in her well-worn napkin picked up the fallen apples. If you want to know more particularly how Mary looked, 10 to 1 you will see a face like hers in the crowded street tomorrow. If you are there on the watch, she will not be among those daughters of Zion who are haughty, and walk with stretched out necks and wanton eyes, mincing as they go. Let all those pass, and fix your eyes on some small plump brownish person of firm but quiet carriage, who looks about her, but does not suppose that anybody is looking at her. If she has a broad face and square brow, well-marked eyebrows and curly dark hair, a certain expression of amusement in her glance which her mouth keeps the secret of, and for the rest features entirely insignificant, take that ordinary but not disagreeable person for a portrait of Mary Garth. If you made her smile, she would show you perfect little Tess. If you made her angry, she would not raise her voice, but would probably say one of the bitterest things you have ever tasted the flavor of. If you did her a kindness, she would never forget it. Mary admired the keen-faced, handsome little vicar in his well-brushed, threadbare clothes more than any man she had had the opportunity of knowing. She had never heard him say a foolish thing, though she knew that he did unwise ones, and perhaps foolish sayings were more objectionable to her than any of Mr. Fairbrother's unwise doings. At least, it was remarkable that the actual imperfections of the vicar's clerical character never seemed to call forth the same scorn and dislike which she showed beforehand for the predicted imperfections of the clerical character sustained by Fred Vincy. These irregularities of judgment, I imagine, are found even in riper minds than Mary Garth's. Our impartiality is kept for abstract merit and demerit, which none of us ever saw. Will any one guess towards which of those widely different men Mary had the peculiar woman's tenderness, the one she was most inclined to be severe on, or the contrary? "Have you any message for your old playfellow, Miss Garth?" said the vicar, as he took a fragrant apple from the basket which she held towards him, and put it in his pocket. "Something to soften down that harsh judgment? I am going straight to see him." "No," said Mary, shaking her head and smiling. "If I were to say that he would not be ridiculous as a clergyman, I must say that he would be something worse than ridiculous. But I am very glad to hear that he is going away to work. On the other hand, I am very glad to hear that you are not going away to work. My mother, I am sure, will be all the happier if you will come to see her at the vicarage. You know she is fond of having young people to talk to, and she has a great deal to tell about old times. You will really be doing a kindness. I should like it very much, if I may," said Mary. "Everything seems too happy for me all at once. I thought it would always be part of my life to long for home, and losing that grievance makes me feel rather empty. I suppose it served instead of sense to fill up my mind." "May I go with you, Mary?" whispered Letty, a most inconvenient child, who listened to everything. But she was made exultant by having her chin pinched and her cheek kissed by Mr. Fairbrother, an incident which she narrated to her mother and father. As the vicar walked to Lowick, any one watching him closely may have seen him twice shrug his shoulders. I think that the rare Englishmen who have this gesture are never of the heavy type, for fear of any lumbering instance to the contrary. I will say, hardly ever. They have usually a fine temperament and much tolerance towards the smaller errors of men themselves inclusive. The vicar was holding an inward dialogue in which he told himself that there was probably something more between Fred and Mary Garth than the regard of old playfellows, and replied with a question whether that bit of womanhood were not a great deal too choice for that crude young gentleman. The rejoinder to this was the first shrug. Then he laughed at himself for being likely to have felt jealous, as if he had been a man able to marry, which, added he, it is as clear as any balance sheet that I am not upon, which followed the second shrug. What could two men, so different from each other, see in this brown patch, as Mary called herself? It was certainly not her plainness that attracted them, and let all plain young ladies be warned against the dangerous encouragement given them by society to confide in their want of beauty. A human being in this aged nation of ours is a very wonderful whole. The slow creation of long interchanging influences and charm is a result of two such wholes, the one loving and the one loved. When Mr. and Mrs. Garth were sitting alone, Caleb said, "Susan, guess what I'm thinking of." "The rotation of crops," said Mrs. Garth, smiling at him above her knitting, "or else the back doors of the Tipton cottages." "No," said Caleb, gravely, "I am thinking that I could do a great turn for Fred Vincy. Christie's gone, Alfred will be gone soon, and it will be 5 years before Jim is ready to take to business. I shall want help, and Fred may come in and learn the nature of things and act under me, and it may be the making of him into a useful man, if he gives up being a parson. What do you think?" "I think there is hardly anything honest that his family would object to more," said Mrs. Garth, decidedly. "What care I about their objecting?" said Caleb, with a sturdiness which he was apt to show when he had an opinion. "The lad is of age and must get his bread. He has sense enough and quickness enough. He likes being on the land, and it's my belief that he could learn business well if he gave his mind to it." "But would he? His father and mother wanted him to be a fine gentleman, and I think he has the same sort of feeling himself. They all think us beneath them, and if the proposal came from you, I am sure Mrs. Vincy would say that we wanted Fred for Mary." "Life is a poor tale, if it is to be settled by nonsense of that sort," said Caleb, with disgust. "Yes, but there is a certain pride which is proper, Caleb. I call it improper pride to let fools' notions hinder you from doing a good action." "There's no sort of work," said Caleb, with fervor, putting out his hand and moving it up and down to mark his emphasis, "that could ever be done well, if you minded what fools say. You must have it inside you that your plan is right, and that plan you must follow." "I will not oppose any plan you have set your mind on, Caleb," said Mrs. Garth, who was a firm woman, but knew that there were some points on which her mild husband was yet firmer. "Still, it seems to be fixed that Fred is to go back to college. Will it not be better to wait and see what he will choose to do after that? It is not easy to keep people against their will, and you are not yet quite sure enough of your own position or what you will want." "Well, it may be better to wait a bit, but as to my getting plenty of work for two, I'm pretty sure of that. I've always had my hands full with scattered things, and there's always something fresh turning up. Why, only yesterday, bless me, I don't think I told you, it was rather odd that two men should have been at me on different sides to do the same bit of valuing." "And who do you think they were?" said Caleb, taking a pinch of snuff and holding it up between his fingers, as if it were a part of his exposition. He was fond of a pinch when it occurred to him, but he usually forgot that this indulgence was at his command. His wife held down her knitting and looked attentive. "Why, that Rig Featherstone was one, but Bulstrode was before him, so I'm going to do it for Bulstrode. Whether it's mortgage or purchase they're going for, I can't tell yet. Can that man be going to sell the land just left him, which he has taken the name for?" said Mrs. Garth. "Deuce knows," said Caleb, who never referred the knowledge of discreditable doings to any higher power than the deuce. "But Bulstrode has long been wanting to get a handsome bit of land under his fingers, that I know." and it's a difficult matter to get in this part of the country. Caleb scattered his snuff carefully instead of taking it, and then added, "The ins and outs of things are curious. Here is the land they've been all along expecting for Fred, which it seems the old man never meant to leave him a foot of, but left it to the side slip of a son that he kept in the dark, and thought of his sticking there and vexing everybody as well as he could have vexed himself if he could have kept alive. I say, it would be curious if it got into Bulstrode's hands after all. The old man hated him and never would bank with him. What reason could the miserable creature have for hating a man whom he had nothing to do with?" said Mrs. Garth. "Pooh, where's the use of asking for such fellows' reasons?" Chapter Roman 41. By swaggering could I never thrive, for the rain it rains every day. 12th night. The transactions referred to by Caleb Garth as having gone forward between Mr. Bulstrode and Mr. Joshua Rigg Featherstone concerning the land attached to Stone Court had occasioned the interchange of a letter or two between these personages. Who shall tell what may be the effect of writing, if it happens to have been cut in stone, though it lie face downmost for ages on a forsaken beach, or rest quietly under the drums and tramplings of many conquests? It may end by letting us into the secret of usurpations and other scandals gossiped about long empires ago, this world being apparently a huge whispering gallery. Such conditions are often minutely represented in our petty lifetimes, as the stone which has been kicked by generations of clowns may come by curious little links of effect under the eyes of a scholar, through whose labors it may at last fix the date of invasions and unlock religions. So a bit of ink and paper which has long been an innocent wrapping or stopgap may at last be laid open under the one pair of eyes which have knowledge enough to turn it into the opening of a catastrophe. To Uriel watching the progress of planetary history from the sun, the one result would be just as much of a coincidence as the other. Having made this rather lofty comparison, I am less uneasy in calling attention to the existence of low people by whose interference, however little we may like it, the course of the world is very much determined. It would be well, certainly, if we could help to reduce their number, and something may perhaps be done by not lightly giving occasion to their existence. Socially speaking, Joshua Rigg would have been generally pronounced a superfluity, but those who, like Peter Featherstone, never had a copy of themselves demanded, are the very last to wait for such a request either in prose or verse. The copy in this case bore more of outside resemblance to the mother, in whose sex frog features, accompanied with fresh-colored cheeks and a well-rounded figure, are compatible with much charm for a certain order of admirers. The result is sometimes a frog-faced male, desirable, surely, to no order of intelligent beings, especially when he is suddenly brought into evidence to frustrate other people's expectations, the very lowest aspect in which a social superfluity can present himself. But Mr. Rigg Featherstone's low characteristics were all of the sober, water-drinking kind. From the earliest to the latest hour of the day he was always as sleek, neat, and cool as the frog he resembled, and old Peter had secretly chuckled over an offshoot almost more calculating, and far more imperturbable, than himself. I will add that his fingernails were scrupulously attended to, and that he meant to marry a well-educated young lady as yet unspecified whose person was good, and whose connections, in a solid middle-class way, were undeniable. Thus his nails and modesty were comparable to those of most gentlemen, though his ambition had been educated only by the opportunities of a clerk and accountant in the smaller commercial houses of a seaport. He thought the rural Featherstones very simple, absurd people, and they in their turn regarded his bringing up in a seaport town as an exaggeration of the monstrosity that their brother Peter, and still more Peter's property, should have had such belongings. The garden and gravel approach, as seen from the two windows of the wainscoted parlor at Stone Court, were never in better trim than now, when Mr. Rigg Featherstone stood, with his hands behind him, looking out on these grounds as their master. But it seemed doubtful whether he looked out for the sake of contemplation or of turning his back to a person who stood in the middle of the room, with his legs considerably apart, and his hands in his trouser pockets, a person in all respects a contrast to the sleek and cool Rig. He was a man obviously on the way towards 60, very florid and hairy, with much grey in his bushy whiskers and thick curly hair, a stoutish body which showed to disadvantage the somewhat worn joinings of his clothes, and the air of a swagger who would aim at being noticeable evening at a show of fireworks, regarding his own remarks on any other person's performance as likely to be more interesting than the performance itself. His name was John Raffles, and he sometimes wrote jocosely WAG after his signature, observing when he did so that he was once taught by Leonard Lamb of Finsbury, who wrote BA after his name, and that he, Raffles, originated the witticism of calling that celebrated Principal Lamb. Such were the appearance and mental flavor of Mr. Raffles, both of which seemed to have a stale odor of travelers' rooms in the commercial hotels of that period. "Come, now, Josh," he was saying, in a full rumbling tone, "look at it in this light. Here is your poor mother going into the vale of years, and you could afford something handsome now to make her comfortable." "Not while you live. Nothing would make her comfortable while you live," returned Rig, in his cool high voice. "What I give her, you'll take. You bear me a grudge, Josh, that I know. But come, now, as between man and man, without humbug, a little capital may enable me to make a first-rate thing of the shop. The tobacco trade is growing. I should cut my own nose off in not doing the best I could at it. I should stick to it like a flea to a fleece for my own sake. I should always be on the spot, and nothing would make your poor mother so happy. I've pretty well done with my wild oats, turned 55. I want to settle down in my chimney corner, and if I once buckled to the tobacco trade, I could bring an amount of brains and experience to bear on it that would not be found elsewhere in a hurry. I don't want to be bothering you one time after another, but to get things once for all into the right channel. Consider that, Josh, as between man, and with your poor mother to be made easy for her life. I was always fond of the old woman, by Jove." "Have you done?" said Mr. Rig quietly, without looking away from the window. "Yes, I've done," said Raffles, taking hold of his hat which stood before him on the table, and giving it a sort of oratorical push. "Then just listen to me. The more you say anything, the less I shall believe it. The more you want me to do a thing, the more reason I shall have for never doing it. Do you think I mean to forget your kicking me when I was a lad, and eating all the best victual away from me and my mother? Do you think I forget your always coming home to sell and pocket everything, and going off again leaving us in the lurch? I should be glad to see you whipped at the cart-tail. My mother was a fool to you. She'd no right to give me a father-in-law, and she's been punished for it. She shall have her weekly allowance paid and no more, and that shall be stopped if you dare to come on to these premises again, or to come into this country after me again. The next time you show yourself inside the gates here, you shall be driven off with the dogs and the wagoner's whip." As Rig pronounced the last words he turned round and looked at Raffles with his prominent frozen eyes. The contrast was as striking as it could have been 18 years before, when Rig was a most unengaging kickable boy, and Raffles was the rather thick-set Adonis of barrooms and back parlours. But the advantage now was on the side of Rig, and auditors of this conversation may probably have expected that Raffles would retire with the air of a defeated dog. Not at all. He made a grimace, which was habitual with him whenever he was out in a game, then subsided into a laugh, and drew a brandy flask from his pocket. "Come, Josh," he said in a cajoling tone, "give us a spoonful of brandy and a sovereign to pay the way back, and I'll go. Honor bright, I'll go like a bullet, by Jove." "Mind," said Rig, drawing out a bunch of keys, "if I ever see you again, I shan't speak to you. I don't own you any more than if I saw a crow, and if you want to own me you'll get nothing by it but a character for being what you are, a spiteful, brassy, bullying rogue." "That's a pity, now, Josh," said Raffles, affecting to scratch his head and wrinkle his brows upward as if he were nonplussed. "I'm very fond of you. By Jove, I am. There's nothing I like better than plaguing you. You're so like your mother, and I must do without it." but the brandy and the sovereigns a bargain. He jerked forward the flask, and Rig went to a fine old oaken bureau with his keys. But Raffles had reminded himself by his movement with the flask that it had become dangerously loose from its leather covering, and catching sight of a folded paper which had fallen within the fender, he took it up and shoved it under the leather so as to make the glass firm. By that time Rig came forward with a brandy bottle, filled the flask, and handed Raffles a sovereign, neither looking at him nor speaking to him. After locking up the bureau again, he walked to the window and gazed out as impassively as he had done at the beginning of the interview, while Raffles took a small allowance from the flask, screwed it up, and deposited it in his side pocket, with provoking slowness, making a grimace at his stepson's back. "Farewell, Josh, and if forever," said Raffles, turning back his head as he opened the door. Rig saw him leave the grounds and enter the lane. The grey day had turned to a light drizzling rain, which freshened the hedgerows and the grassy borders of the byroads, and hastened the labourers who were loading the last shocks of corn. Raffles, walking with the uneasy gait of a town loiterer obliged to do a bit of country journeying on foot, looked as incongruous amid this moist rural quiet and industry as if he had been a baboon escaped from a menagerie. But there were none to stare at him except the long-weaned calves, and none to show dislike of his appearance except the little water rats, which rustled away at his approach. He was fortunate enough when he got onto the highroad to be overtaken by the stagecoach, which carried him to Brassing, and there he took the new-made railway, observing to his fellow passengers that he considered it pretty well seasoned now it had done for Huskisson. Mr. Raffles on most occasions kept up the sense of having been educated at an academy, and being able, if he chose, to pass well everywhere. Truly, there was not one of his fellow-men whom he did not feel himself in a position to ridicule and torment. Confident of the entertainment which he thus gave to all the rest of the company, he played this part now with as much spirit as if his journey had been entirely successful, resorting at frequent intervals to his flask. Chapter Roman 42. How much, methinks, I could despise this man, were I not bound in charity against it. Shakespeare, Henry Roman 8. One of the professional calls made by Lydgate soon after his return from his wedding journey was to Lowick Manor, in consequence of a letter, which had requested him to fix a time for his visit. Mr. Casaubon had never put any question concerning the nature of his illness to Lydgate, nor had he evening to Dorothea betrayed any anxiety as to how far it may be likely to cut short his labors or his life. On this point, as on all others, he shrank from pity, and of the suspicion of being pitied for anything in his lot surmised or known in spite of himself was embittering. The idea of calling forth a show of compassion by frankly admitting an alarm or a sorrow was necessarily intolerable to him. Every proud mind knows something of this experience, and perhaps it is only to be overcome by a sense of fellowship deep enough to make all efforts at isolation seem mean and petty instead of exalting. But Mr. Casaubon was now brooding over something through which the question of his health and life haunted his silence with a more harassing importunity evening than through the autumnal unripeness of his authorship. It is true that this last may be called his central ambition, but there are some kinds of authorship in which by far the largest result is the uneasy susceptibility accumulated in the consciousness of the author. One knows of the river by a few streaks amid a long-gathered deposit of uncomfortable mud. That was the way with Mr. Casaubon's hard intellectual labors. Their most characteristic result was not the key to all mythologies, but a morbid consciousness that others did not give him the place which he had not demonstrably merited, a perpetual suspicious conjecture that the views entertained of him were not to his advantage, a melancholy absence of passion in his efforts at achievement, and a passionate resistance to the confession that he had achieved nothing. Thus his intellectual ambition, which seemed to others to have absorbed and dried him, was really no security against wounds, least of all against those which came from Dorothea, and he had begun now to frame possibilities for the future, which were somehow more embittering to him than anything his mind had dwelt on before. Against certain facts he was helpless, against Wladislaw's existence, his defiant stay in the neighborhood of Lowick, and his flippant state of mind with regard to the possessors of authentic, well-stamped erudition against Dorothea's nature, always taking on some new shape of ardent activity, and evening in submission and silence covering fervid reasons which it was an irritation to think of, against certain notions and likings which had taken possession of her mind in relation to subjects that he could not possibly discuss with her. There was no denying that Dorothea was as virtuous and lovely a young lady as he could have obtained for a wife, but a young lady turned out to be something more troublesome than he had conceived. She nursed him, she read to him, she anticipated his wants, and was solicitous about his feelings, but there had entered into the husband's mind the certainty that she judged him, and that her wifely devotedness was like a penitential expiation of unbelieving thoughts, was accompanied with a power of comparison by which himself and his doings were seen too luminously as a part of things in general. His discontent passed vapor-like through all her gentle loving manifestations, and clung to that inappreciative world which she had only brought nearer to him. Poor Mr. Casaubon! This suffering was the harder to bear, because it seemed like a betrayal. The young creature who had worshipped him with perfect trust had quickly turned into the critical wife, and early instances of criticism and resentment had made an impression which no tenderness and submission afterwards could remove. To his suspicious interpretation, Dorothea's silence now was a suppressed rebellion, a remark from her, which he had not in any way anticipated was an assertion of conscious superiority. Her gentle answers had an irritating cautiousness in them, and when she acquiesced it was a self-approved effort of forbearance. The tenacity with which he strove to hide this inward drama made it the more vivid for him, as we hear with the more keenness what we wish others not to hear. Instead of wondering at this result of misery in Mr. Casaubon, I think it quite ordinary. Will not a tiny speck very close to our vision blot out the glory of the world, and leave only a margin by which we see the blot? I know no speck so troublesome as self. And who, if Mr. Casaubon had chosen to expound his discontents, his suspicions, that he was not any longer adored without criticism, could have denied that they were founded on good reasons? On the contrary, there was a strong reason to be added, which he had not himself taken explicitly into account, namely, that he was not unmixedly adorable. He suspected this, however, as he suspected other things, without confessing it, and like the rest of us, felt how soothing it would have been to have a companion who would never find it out. This sore susceptibility in relation to Dorothea was thoroughly prepared before Władysław had returned to Lowick, and what had occurred since then had brought Mr. Casaubon's power of suspicious construction into exasperated activity. To all the facts which he knew, he added imaginary facts both present and future which became more real to him than those because they called up a stronger dislike, a more predominating bitterness. Suspicion and jealousy of Władysław's intentions, suspicion and jealousy of Dorothea's impressions, were constantly at their weaving work. It would be quite unjust to him to suppose that he could have entered into any coarse misinterpretation of Dorothea, his own habits of mind and conduct, quite as much as the open elevation of her nature, saved him from any such mistake. What he was jealous of was her opinion, the sway that may be given to her ardent mind in its judgments, and the future possibilities to which these may lead her. As to Will, though until his last defiant letter he had nothing definite which he would choose formally to allege against him, he felt himself warranted in believing that he was capable of any design which could fascinate a rebellious temper and an undisciplined impulsiveness. He was quite sure that Dorothea was the cause of Will's return from Rome, and his determination to settle in the neighborhood, and he was penetrating enough to imagine that Dorothea had innocently encouraged this course. It was as clear as possible that she was ready to be attached to Will and to be pliant to his suggestions. They had never had a TTE without her bringing away from it some new troublesome impression, and the last interview that Mr. Casaubon was aware of Dorothea, on returning from Freshitt Hall, had for the first time been silent about having seen Will had led to a scene which roused an angrier feeling against them both than he had ever known before. Dorothea's outpouring of her notions about money, in the darkness of the night, had done nothing but bring a mixture of more odious foreboding into her husband's mind, and there was the shock lately given to his health always sadly present with him. He was certainly much revived. He had recovered all his usual power of work. The illness may have been mere fatigue, and there may still be 20 years of achievement before him, which would justify the 30 years of preparation. That prospect was made the sweeter by a flavor of vengeance against the hasty sneers of Carp and Company for evening. When Mr. Casaubon was carrying his taper among the tombs of the past, those modern figures came athwart the dim light and interrupted his diligent exploration to convince Carp of his mistake, so that he would have to eat his own words with a good deal of indigestion, would be an agreeable accident of triumphant authorship, which the prospect of living to future ages on earth and to all eternity in heaven could not exclude from contemplation, since, thus, the provision of his own unending bliss could not nullify the bitter savors of irritated jealousy and vindictiveness. It is the less surprising that the probability of a transient earthly bliss for other persons, when he himself should have entered into glory, had not a potently sweetening effect. If the truth should be that some undermining disease was at work within him, there may be large opportunity for some people to be the happier when he was gone, and if one of those people should be Will Ladislaw, Mr. Casaubon objected so strongly that it seemed as if the annoyance would make part of his disembodied existence. This is a very bare, and therefore a very incomplete way of putting the case. The human soul moves in many channels, and Mr. Casaubon, we know, had a sense of rectitude and an honorable pride in satisfying the requirements of honor, which compelled him to find other reasons for his conduct than those of jealousy and vindictiveness. The way in which Mr. Casaubon put the case was this: in marrying Dorothea Brooke I had to care for her well-being in case of my death. But well-being is not to be secured by ample, independent possession of property. On the contrary, occasions may arise in which such possession may expose her to the more danger. She is ready prey to any man who knows how to play adroitly either on her affectionate ardor or her quixotic enthusiasm, and a man stands by with that very intention in his mind, a man with no other principle than transient caprice, and who has a personal animosity towards me, I am sure of it, an animosity which is fed by the consciousness of his ingratitude, and which he has constantly vented in ridicule, of which I am as well assured as if I had heard it. Evening, if I live I shall not be without uneasiness as to what he may attempt through indirect influence. This man has gained Dorothea's ear, he has fascinated her attention, he has evidently tried to impress her mind with the notion that he has claims beyond anything I have done for him. If I die, and he is waiting here on the watch for that, he will persuade her to marry him. That would be calamity for her and success for him. She would not think it calamity, he would make her believe anything. She has a tendency to immoderate attachment, which she inwardly reproaches me for not responding to, and already her mind is occupied with his fortunes. He thinks of an easy conquest and of entering into my nest. That I will hinder. Such a marriage would be fatal to Dorothea. Has he ever persisted in anything except from contradiction? In knowledge he has always tried to be showy at small cost. In religion he could be, as long as it suited him, the facile echo of Dorothea's vagaries. When was sciolism ever dissociated from laxity? I utterly distrust his morals, and it is my duty to hinder to the utmost the fulfillment of his designs. The arrangements made by Mr. Casaubon on his marriage left strong measures open to him, but in ruminating on them his mind inevitably dwelt so much on the probabilities of his own life that the longing to get the nearest possible calculation had at last overcome his proud reticence, and had determined him to ask Lydgate's opinion as to the nature of his illness. He had mentioned to Dorothea that Lydgate was coming by appointment at 3:30, and in answer to her anxious question whether he had felt ill, replied, "No, I merely wished to have his opinion concerning some habitual symptoms." "You need not see him, my dear. I shall give orders that he may be sent to me in the yew tree walk, where I shall be taking my usual exercise." When Lydgate entered the yew tree walk he saw Mr. Casaubon slowly receding with his hands behind him according to his habit, and his head bent forward. It was a lovely afternoon. The leaves from the lofty limes were falling silently across the somber evergreens, while the lights and shadows slept side by side. There was no sound but the cawing of the rooks, which to the accustomed ear is a lullaby, or that last solemn lullaby, a dirge. Lydgate, conscious of an energetic frame in its prime, felt some compassion when the figure which he was likely soon to overtake turned round, and in advancing towards him showed more markedly than ever the signs of premature age. The student's bent shoulders, the emaciated limbs, and the melancholy lines of the mouth. Poor fellow, he thought. Some men with his years are like lions. One can tell nothing of their age except that they are full grown. Mr. Lydgate, said Mr. Casaubon, with his invariably polite air, I'm exceedingly obliged to you for your punctuality. We will, if you please, carry on our conversation in walking to and fro. I hope your wish to see me is not due to the return of unpleasant symptoms, said Lydgate, filling up a pause. Not immediately, no. In order to account for that wish I must mention, what it were otherwise needless to refer to, that my life, on all collateral accounts insignificant, derives a possible importance from the incompleteness of labors which have extended through all its best years. In short, I have long had on hand a work which I would fain leave behind me in such a state, at least, that it may be committed to the press by others. Were I assured that this is the utmost I can reasonably expect, that assurance would be a useful circumscription of my attempts, and a guide in both the positive and negative determination of my course. Here Mr. Casaubon paused, removed one hand from his back, and thrust it between the buttons of his single-breasted coat. To a mind largely instructed in the human destiny, hardly anything could be more interesting than the inward conflict implied in his formal measured address, delivered with the usual sing-song and motion of the head. No, are there many situations more sublimely tragic than the struggle of the soul with the demand to renounce a work which has been all the significance of its life, a significance which is to vanish as the waters which come and go where no man has need of them? But there was nothing to strike others as sublime about Mr. Casaubon, and Lydgate, who had some contempt at hand for feudal scholarship, felt a little amusement mingling with his pity. He was at present too ill acquainted with disaster to enter into the pathos of a lot where everything is below the level of tragedy except the passionate egoism of the sufferer. You refer to the possible hindrances from want of health, he said, wishing to help forward Mr. Casaubon's purpose, which seemed to be clogged by some hesitation. I do. You have not implied to me that the symptoms which, I am bound to testify, you watched with scrupulous care, were those of a fatal disease. But were it so, Mr. Lydgate, I should desire to know the truth without reservation, and I appeal to you for an exact statement of your conclusions. I request it as a friendly service. If you can tell me that my life is not threatened by anything else than ordinary casualties, I shall rejoice, on grounds which I have already indicated. If not, knowledge of the truth is even more important to me. Then I can no longer hesitate as to my course, said Lydgate. But the first thing I must impress on you is that my conclusions are doubly uncertain. Uncertain not only because of my fallibility, but because diseases of the heart are eminently difficult to found predictions on. In any case, one can hardly increase appreciably the tremendous uncertainty of life. Mr. Casaubon winced perceptibly, but bowed. I believe that you are suffering from what is called fatty degeneration of the heart, a disease which was first divined and explored by Linnæus, the man who gave us the stethoscope, not so very many years ago. A good deal of experience, a more lengthened observation, is wanting on the subject, but after what you have said, it is my duty to tell you that death from this disease is often sudden. At the same time, no such result can be predicted. Your condition may be consistent with a tolerably comfortable life for another 15 years, or even more. I could add no information to this beyond anatomical or medical details, which would leave expectation at precisely the same point. Lydgate's instinct was fine enough to tell him that plain speech, quite free from ostentatious caution, would be felt by Mr. Casaubon as a tribute of respect. I thank you, Mr. Lydgate, said Mr. Casaubon after a moment's pause. One thing more I have still to ask. Did you communicate what you have now told me to Mrs. Casaubon? Partly, I mean, as to the possible issues. Lydgate was going to explain why he had told Dorothea, but Mr. Casaubon, with an unmistakable desire to end the conversation, waved his hand slightly and said again, "I thank you," proceeding to remark on the rare beauty of the day. Lydgate, certain that his patient wished to be alone, soon left him, and the black figure with hands behind and head bent forward continued to pace the walk where the dark yew trees gave him a mute companionship in melancholy, and the little shadows of bird or leaf that fleeted across the aisles of sunlight stole along in silence as in the presence of a sorrow. Here was a man who now for the first time found himself looking into the eyes of death, who was passing through one of those rare moments of experience when we feel the truth of a commonplace, which is as different from what we call knowing it, as the vision of waters upon the earth is different from the delirious vision of the water which cannot be had to cool the burning tongue. When the commonplace, "we must all die," transforms itself suddenly into the acute consciousness, "I must die, and soon," then death grapples us, and his fingers are cruel. Afterwards he may come to fold us in his arms as our mother did, and our last moment of dim earthly discerning may be like the first. To Mr. Casaubon now, it was as if he suddenly found himself on the dark river brink and heard the plash of the oncoming oar, not discerning the forms, but expecting the summons. In such an hour the mind does not change its lifelong bias, but carries it onward in imagination to the other side of death, gazing backward, perhaps with the divine calm of beneficence, perhaps with the petty anxieties of self-assertion. What was Mr. Casaubon's bias his acts will give us a clue to. He held himself to be, with some private scholarly reservations, a believing Christian as to estimates of the present and hopes of the future. But what we strive to gratify, though we may call it a distant hope, is an immediate desire. The future estate for which men drudge up city alleys exists already in their imagination and love. And Mr. Casaubon's immediate desire was not for divine communion and light divested of earthly conditions. His passionate longings, poor man, clung low and mist-like in very shady places. Dorothea had been aware when Lydgate had ridden away, and she had stepped into the garden with the impulse to go at once to her husband, but she hesitated, fearing to offend him by obtruding herself, for her ardor, continually repulsed, served, with her intense memory, to heighten her dread, as thwarted energy subsides into a shudder, and she wandered slowly round the near clumps of trees until she saw him advancing. Then she went towards him, and may have represented a heaven-sent angel coming with a promise that the short hours remaining should yet be filled with that faithful love which clings the closer to a comprehended grief. His glance in reply to hers was so chill that she felt her timidity increased, yet she turned and passed her hand through his arm. Mr. Casaubon kept his hands behind him and allowed her pliant arm to cling with difficulty against his rigid arm. There was something horrible to Dorothea in the sensation which this unresponsive hardness inflicted on her. That is a strong word, but not too strong. It is in these acts called trivialities that the seeds of joy are forever wasted, until men and women look round with haggard faces at the devastation their own waste has made, and say, "The earth bears no harvest of sweetness," calling their denial knowledge. You may ask why, in the name of manliness, Mr. Casaubon should have behaved in that way. Consider that his was a mind which shrank from pity. Have you ever watched in such a mind the effect of a suspicion that what is pressing it as a grief may be really a source of contentment, either actual or future, to the being who already offends by pitying? Besides, he knew little of Dorothea's sensations, and had not reflected that on such an occasion as the present they were comparable in strength to his own sensibilities about Carp's criticisms. Dorothea did not withdraw her arm, but she could not venture to speak. Mr. Casaubon did not say, "I wish to be alone," but he directed his steps in silence towards the house, and as they entered by the glass door on this eastern side, Dorothea withdrew her arm and lingered on the matting, that she may leave her husband quite free. He entered the library and shut himself in, alone with his sorrow. She went up to her boudoir, the open bow window let in the serene glory of the afternoon lying in the avenue, where the lime trees cast long shadows. But Dorothea knew nothing of the scene. She threw herself on a chair, not heeding that she was in the dazzling sun rays. If there were discomfort in that, how could she tell that it was not part of her inward misery? She was in the reaction of a rebellious anger stronger than any she had felt since her marriage. Instead of tears there came words. What have I done? What am I, that he should treat me so? He never knows what is in my mind. He never cares. What is the use of anything I do? He wishes he had never married me. She began to hear herself, and was checked into stillness. Like one who has lost his way and is weary, she sat and saw as in one glance all the paths of her young hope which she should never find again. And just as clearly in the miserable light she saw her own and her husband's solitude, how they walked apart so that she was obliged to survey him. If he had drawn her towards him, she would never have surveyed him, never have said, "Is he worth living for?" but would have felt him simply a part of her own life. Now she said bitterly, "It is his fault, not mine." In the jar of her whole being, pity was overthrown. Was it her fault that she had believed in him, had believed in his worthiness? And what, exactly, was he? She was able enough to estimate him, she who waited on his glances with trembling, and shut her best soul in prison, paying it only hidden visits, that she may be petty enough to please him. In such a crisis as this, some women begin to hate. The sun was low when Dorothea was thinking that she would not go down again, but would send a message to her husband saying that she was not well and preferred remaining upstairs. She had never deliberately allowed her resentment to govern her in this way before, but she believed now that she could not see him again without telling him the truth about her feeling, and she must wait till she could do it without interruption. He may wonder and be hurt at her message. It was good that he should wonder and be hurt. Her anger said, as anger is apt to say, that God was with her, that all heaven, though it were crowded with spirits watching them, must be on her side. She had determined to ring her bell when there came a rap at the door. Mr. Casaubon had sent to say that he would have his dinner in the library. He wished to be quite alone this evening, being much occupied. "I shall not dine, then, Tantrip." "Oh, madam, let me bring you a little something?" "No, I am not well. Get everything ready in my dressing room, but pray do not disturb me again." Dorothea sat almost motionless in her meditative struggle, while the evening slowly deepened into night. But the struggle changed continually, as that of a man who begins with a movement towards striking and ends with conquering his desire to strike. The energy that would animate a crime is not more than is wanted to inspire a resolved submission when the noble habit of the soul reasserts itself. That thought with which Dorothea had gone out to meet her husband, her conviction that he had been asking about the possible arrest of all his work, and that the answer must have wrung his heart, could not be long without rising beside the image of him, like a shadowy monitor looking at her anger with sad remonstrance. It cost her a litany of pictured sorrows and of silent cries, that she may be the mercy for those sorrows, but the result submission did come, and when the house was still, and she knew that it was near the time when Mr. Casaubon habitually went to rest, she opened her door gently, and stood outside in the darkness waiting for his coming upstairs with a light in his hand. If he did not come soon, she thought that she would go down, an evening risk incurring another pang. She would never again expect anything else. But she did hear the library door open, and slowly the light advanced up the staircase without noise from the footsteps on the carpet. When her husband stood opposite to her, she saw that his face was more haggard. He started slightly on seeing her, and she looked up at him beseechingly, without speaking. "Dorothea," he said with a gentle surprise in his tone, "were you waiting for me?" "Yes, I did not like to disturb you." "Come, my dear, come. You are young, and need not to extend your life by watching." When the kind, quiet melancholy of that speech fell on Dorothea's ears, she felt something like the thankfulness that may well up in us if we had narrowly escaped hurting a lamed creature. Chapter Roman 43. This figure has high price. Tea was wrought with love, ages ago in finest ivory, not modish in it, pure and noble lines, of generous womanhood that fits all time. That too is costly wear, majolica, of deft design, to please a lordly eye. The smile, you see, is perfect, wonderful, as mere faience, a table ornament, to suit the richest mounting. Dorothea seldom left home without her husband, but she did occasionally drive into Middlemarch alone, on little errands of shopping or charity such as occur to every lady of any wealth when she lives within 3 miles of a town. 2 days after that scene in the yew tree walk, she determined to use such an opportunity in order, if possible, to see Lydgate, and learn from him whether her husband had really felt any depressing change of symptoms which he was concealing from her, and whether he had insisted on knowing the utmost about himself. She felt almost guilty in asking for knowledge about him from another, but the dread of being without it, the dread of that ignorance which would make her unjust or hard, overcame every scruple. That there had been some crisis in her husband's mind she was certain. He had the very next day begun a new method of arranging his notes, and had associated her quite newly in carrying out his plan. Poor Dorothea needed to lay up stores of patience. It was about 4 o'clock when she drove to Lydgate's house in Lowick Gate, wishing, in her immediate doubt of finding him at home, that she had written beforehand. And he was not at home. "Is Mrs. Lydgate at home?" said Dorothea, who had never, that she knew of, seen Rosamond, but now remembered the fact of the marriage. "Yes, Mrs. Lydgate was at home. I will go in and speak to her, if she will allow me. Will you ask her if she can see me?" "See Mrs. Casaubon for a few minutes." When the servant had gone to deliver that message, Dorothea could hear sounds of music through an open window, a few notes from a man's voice, and then a piano bursting into roulades. But the roulades broke off suddenly, and then the servant came back saying that Mrs. Lydgate would be happy to see Mrs. Casaubon. When the drawing-room door opened, and Dorothea entered, there was a sort of contrast not infrequent in country life, when the habits of the different ranks were less blent than now. Let those who know tell us exactly what stuff it was that Dorothea wore in those days of mild autumn, that thin white woolen stuff, soft to the touch and soft to the eye. It always seemed to have been lately washed, and to smell of the sweet hedges, was always in the shape of a pelisse with sleeves hanging all out of the fashion. Yet if she had entered before a still audience as Imogen or Cato's daughter, the dress may have seemed right enough. The grace and dignity were in her limbs and neck, and about her simply parted hair and candid eyes the large round poke, which was then in the fate of women, seemed no more odd as a headdress than the gold trencher we call a halo. By the present audience of 2 persons, no dramatic heroine could have been expected with more interest than Mrs. Casaubon. To Rosamond she was one of those county divinities not mixing with Middlemarch mortality, whose slightest marks of manner or appearance were worthy of her study. Moreover, Rosamond was not without satisfaction that Mrs. Casaubon should have an opportunity of studying her. What is the use of being exquisite, if you are not seen by the best judges? And, since Rosamond had received the highest compliments at Sir Godwin Lydgate's, she felt quite confident of the impression she must make on people of good birth. Dorothea put out her hand with her usual simple kindness, and looked admiringly at Lydgate's lovely bride, aware that there was a gentleman standing at a distance, but seeing him merely as a coated figure at a wide angle. The gentleman was too much occupied with the presence of the one woman to reflect on the contrast between the two, a contrast that would certainly have been striking to a calm observer. They were both tall, and their eyes were on a level, but imagine Rosamond's infantine blondness and wondrous crown of hair plaits, with her pale blue dress of a fit and fashion so perfect that no dressmaker could look at it without emotion, a large embroidered collar which it was to be hoped all beholders would know the price of, her small hands duly set off with rings, and that controlled self-consciousness of manner which is the expensive substitute for simplicity. "Thank you very much for allowing me to interrupt you," said Dorothea immediately. "I am anxious to see Mr. Lydgate, if possible, before I go home, and I hoped that you may possibly tell me where I could find him, or evening allow me to wait for him, if you expect him soon." "He is at the new hospital," said Rosamond. I am not sure how soon he will come home, but I can send for him. Will you let me go and fetch him?" said Will Ladislaw, coming forward. He had already taken up his hat before Dorothea entered. She colored with surprise, but put out her hand with a smile of unmistakable pleasure, saying, "I did not know it was you. I had no thought of seeing you here. May I go to the hospital and tell Mr. Lydgate that you wish to see him?" said Will. "It would be quicker to send the carriage for him," said Dorothea, "if you will be kind enough to give the message to the coachman." Will was moving to the door when Dorothea, whose mind had flashed in an instant over many connected memories, turned quickly and said, "I will go myself. Thank you. I wish to lose no time before getting home again. I will drive to the hospital and see Mr. Lydgate there. Pray excuse me, Mrs. Lydgate. I am very much obliged to you." Her mind was evidently arrested by some sudden thought, and she left the room hardly conscious of what was immediately around her, hardly conscious that Will opened the door for her and offered her his arm to lead her to the carriage. She took the arm, but said nothing. Will was feeling rather vexed and miserable, and found nothing to say on his side. He handed her into the carriage in silence. They said goodbye, and Dorothea drove away. In the 5 minutes' drive to the hospital she had time for some reflections that were quite new to her. Her decision to go, and her preoccupation in leaving the room, had come from the sudden sense that there would be a sort of deception in her voluntarily allowing any further intercourse between herself and Will which she was unable to mention to her husband, and already her errand in seeking Lydgate was a matter of concealment. That was all that had been explicitly in her mind, but she had been urged also by a vague discomfort. Now that she was alone in her drive, she heard the notes of the man's voice and the accompanying piano, which she had not noted much at the time, returning on her inward sense, and she found herself thinking with some wonder that Will Ladislaw was passing his time with Mrs. Lydgate in her husband's absence, and then she could not help remembering that he had passed some time with her under like circumstances, so why should there be any unfitness in the fact? But Will was Mr. Casaubon's relative, and one towards whom she was bound to show kindness. Still there had been signs, which perhaps she ought to have understood as implying that Mr. Casaubon did not like his cousin's visits during his own absence. "Perhaps I have been mistaken in many things," said poor Dorothea to herself, while the tears came rolling and she had to dry them quickly. She felt confusedly unhappy, and the image of Will, which had been so clear to her before, was mysteriously spoiled. But the carriage stopped at the gate of the hospital. She was soon walking round the grass plots with Lydgate, and her feelings recovered the strong bent which had made her seek for this interview. Will Ladislaw, meanwhile, was mortified and knew the reason of it clearly enough. His chances of meeting Dorothea were rare, and here for the first time there had come a chance which had set him at a disadvantage. It was not only, as it had been hitherto, that she was not supremely occupied with him, but that she had seen him under circumstances in which he may appear not to be supremely occupied with her. He felt thrust to a new distance from her, amongst the circles of Middlemarchers, who made no part of her life. But that was not his fault, of course. Since he had taken his lodgings in the town, he had been making as many acquaintances as he could, his position requiring that he should know everybody and everything. Lydgate was really better worth knowing than any one else in the neighborhood, and he happened to have a wife who was musical and altogether worth calling upon. Here was the whole history of the situation in which Diana had descended too unexpectedly on her worshipper. It was mortifying, Will was conscious, that he should not have been at Middlemarch but for Dorothea, and yet his position there was threatening to divide him from her with those barriers of habitual sentiment which are more fatal to the persistence of mutual interest than all the distance between Rome and Britain. Prejudices about rank and status were easy enough to defy in the form of a tyrannical letter from Mr. Casaubon, but prejudices, like odorous bodies, have a double existence, both solid and subtle, solid as the pyramids, subtle as the 20s echo of an echo, or as the memory of hyacinths which once scented the darkness. And Will was of a temperament to feel keenly the presence of subtleties a man of clumsier perceptions would not have felt, as he did, that for the first time some sense of unfitness in perfect freedom with him had sprung up in Dorothea's mind, and that their silence, as he conducted her to the carriage, had had a chill in it. Perhaps Casaubon, in his hatred and jealousy, had been insisting to Dorothea that Will had slid below her socially. Confound Casaubon! Will re-entered the drawing-room, took up his hat, and looking irritated as he advanced towards Mrs. Lydgate, who had seated herself at her work-table, said, "It is always fatal to have music or poetry interrupted. May I come another day and just finish about the rendering of Lundi dal caro bene?" "I shall be happy to be taught," said Rosamond, "but I am sure you admit that the interruption was a very beautiful one. I quite envy your acquaintance with Mrs. Casaubon. Is she very clever?" "She looks as if she were." "Really, I never thought about it," said Will, sulkily. "That is just the answer Tertius gave me when I first asked him if she were handsome." "What is it that you gentlemen are thinking of when you are with Mrs. Casaubon?" "Herself," said Will, not indisposed to provoke the charming Mrs. Lydgate. "When one sees a perfect woman, one never thinks of her attributes, one is conscious of her presence." "I shall be jealous when Tertius goes to Lowick," said Rosamond, dimpling, and speaking with airy lightness. "He will come back and think nothing of me." That does not seem to have been the effect on Lydgate hitherto. "Mrs. Casaubon is too unlike other women for them to be compared with her. You are a devout worshipper, I perceive. You often see her, I suppose." "No," said Will, almost pettishly. "Worship is usually a matter of theory rather than of practice. But I am practicing it to excess just at this moment. I must really tear myself away. Pray come again some evening. Mr. Lydgate will like to hear the music, and I cannot enjoy it so well without him." When her husband was at home again, Rosamond said, standing in front of him and holding his coat collar with both her hands, "Mr. Ladislaw was here singing with me when Mrs. Casaubon came in. He seemed vexed. Do you think he disliked her seeing him at our house? Surely your position is more than equal to his, whatever may be his relation to the Casaubons." "No, no, it must be something else if he were really vexed. Ladislaw is a sort of gypsy. He thinks nothing of leather and prunella. Music apart, he is not always very agreeable." "Do you like him?" "Yes, I think he is a good fellow, rather miscellaneous and bric-a-brac, but likable. Do you know, I think he adores Mrs. Casaubon." "Poor devil," said Lydgate, smiling and pinching his wife's ears. Rosamond felt herself beginning to know a great deal of the world, especially in discovering what when she was in her unmarried girlhood had been inconceivable to her except as a dim tragedy in bygone costumes, that women, evening after marriage, may make conquests and enslave men. At that time young ladies in the country, evening when educated at Mrs. Lemon's, read little French literature later than Racine, and public prints had not cast their present magnificent illumination over the scandals of life. Still, vanity, with a woman's whole mind and day to work in, can construct abundantly on slight hints, especially on such a hint as the possibility of indefinite conquests. How delightful to make captives from the throne of marriage with a husband as crown prince by your side, himself in fact a subject, while the captives look up forever hopeless, losing their rest probably, and if their appetite too, so much the better. But Rosamond's romance turned at present chiefly on her crown prince, and it was enough to enjoy his assured subjection. When he said, "Poor devil," she asked, with playful curiosity, "Why so?" "Why, what can a man do when he takes to adoring one of you mermaids? He only neglects his work and runs up bills." "I am sure you do not neglect your work. You are always at the hospital, or seeing poor patients, or thinking about some doctor's quarrel, and then at home you always want to pore over your microscope and files. Confess you like those things better than me. Haven't you ambition enough to wish that your husband should be something better than a Middlemarch doctor?" said Lydgate, letting his hands fall onto his wife's shoulders, and looking at her with affectionate gravity. I shall make you learn my favorite bit from an old poet. Why should our pride make such a stir to be, and be forgot? What good is like to this, to do worthy the writing, and to write, worthy the reading and the world's delight? What I want, Rosie, is to do worthy the writing, and to write out myself what I have done. A man must work to do that, my pet. Of course, I wish you to make discoveries. No one could more wish you to attain a high position in some better place than Middlemarch. You cannot say that I have ever tried to hinder you from working. But we cannot live like hermits. You are not discontented with me, Tertius? No, dear, no. I am too entirely contented. But what did Mrs. Casaubon want to say to you? Merely to ask about her husband's health. Chapter Roman 44. I would not creep along the coast, but steer out in a mid-sea by guidance of the stars. When Dorothea, walking round the laurel-planted plots of the new hospital with Lydgate, had learned from him that there were no signs of change in Mr. Casaubon's bodily condition beyond the mental sign of anxiety to know the truth about his illness, she was silent for a few moments, wondering whether she had said or done anything to rouse this new anxiety. Lydgate, not willing to let slip an opportunity of furthering a favorite purpose, ventured to say, I don't know whether your or Mr. Casaubon's attention has been drawn to the needs of our new hospital. Circumstances have made it seem rather egotistic in me to urge the subject, but that is not my fault. It is because there is a fight being made against it by the other medical men. I think you are generally interested in such things, for I remember that when I first had the pleasure of seeing you at Tipton Grange before your marriage, you were asking me some questions about the way in which the health of the poor was affected by their miserable housing. Yes, truly, said Dorothea, brightening. I shall be quite grateful to you if you will tell me how I can help to make things a little better. Everything of that sort has slipped away from me since I have been married. I mean, she said, after a moment's hesitation, that the people in our village are tolerably comfortable, and my mind has been too much taken up for me to inquire further. But here, in such a place as Middlemarch, there must be a great deal to be done. There is everything to be done, said Lydgate, with abrupt energy, and this hospital is a capital piece of work, due entirely to Mr. Bulstrode's exertions and in a great degree to his money. But one man can't do everything in a scheme of this sort. Of course he looked forward to help, and now there's a mean, petty feud set up against the thing in the town, by certain persons who want to make it a failure. What can be their reasons? Said Dorothea, with naive surprise. Chiefly Mr. Bulstrode's unpopularity, to begin with. Half the town would almost take trouble for the sake of thwarting him. In this stupid world most people never consider that a thing is good to be done unless it is done by their own set. I had no connection with Bulstrode before I came here. I look at him quite impartially, and I see that he has some notions, that he has set things on foot, which I can turn to good public purpose. If a fair number of the better educated men went to work with the belief that their observations may contribute to the reform of medical doctrine and practice, we should soon see a change for the better. That's my point of view. I hold that by refusing to work with Mr. Bulstrode I should be turning my back on an opportunity of making my profession more generally serviceable. I quite agree with you, said Dorothea, at once fascinated by the situation sketched in Lydgate's words. But what is there against Mr. Bulstrode? I know that my uncle is friendly with him. People don't like his religious tone, said Lydgate, breaking off there. That is all the stronger reason for despising such an opposition, said Dorothea, looking at the affairs of Middlemarch by the light of the great persecutions. To put the matter quite fairly, they have other objections to him. He is masterful and rather unsociable, and he is concerned with trade, which has complaints of its own that I know nothing about. But what has that to do with the question whether it would not be a fine thing to establish here a more valuable hospital than any they have in the county? The immediate motive to the opposition, however, is the fact that Bulstrode has put the medical direction into my hands. Of course I am glad of that. It gives me an opportunity of doing some good work, and I am aware that I have to justify his choice of me. But the consequence is that the whole profession in Middlemarch have set themselves tooth and nail against the hospital, and not only refuse to cooperate themselves, but try to blacken the whole affair and hinder subscriptions. How very petty! Exclaimed Dorothea, indignantly. I suppose one must expect to fight one's way. There is hardly anything to be done without it. And the ignorance of people about here is stupendous. I don't lay claim to anything else than having used some opportunities which have not come within everybody's reach, but there is no stifling the offense of being young, and a newcomer, and happening to know something more than the old inhabitants. Still, if I believe that I can set going a better method of treatment, if I believe that I can pursue certain observations and inquiries which may be a lasting benefit to medical practice, I should be a base truckler if I allowed any consideration of personal comfort to hinder me. And the course is all the clearer from there being no salary in question to put my persistence in an equivocal light. I am glad you have told me this, Mr. Lydgate, said Dorothea cordially. I feel sure I can help a little. I have some money and don't know what to do with it. That is often an uncomfortable thought to me. I am sure I can spare 200 a year for a grand purpose like this. How happy you must be to know things that you feel sure will do great good. I wish I could awake with that knowledge every morning. There seems to be so much trouble taken that one can hardly see the good of. There was a melancholy cadence in Dorothea's voice as she spoke these last words, but she soon added, more cheerfully, "Pray come to Lowick and tell us more of this. I will mention the subject to Mr. Casaubon. I must hasten home now." She did mention it that evening, and said that she should like to subscribe 200 a year. She had 700 a year as the equivalent of her own fortune, settled on her at her marriage. Mr. Casaubon made no objection beyond a passing remark that the sum may be disproportionate in relation to other good objects, but when Dorothea in her ignorance resisted that suggestion, he acquiesced. He did not care himself about spending money, and was not reluctant to give it. If he ever felt keenly any question of money, it was through the medium of another passion than the love of material property. Dorothea told him that she had seen Lydgate, and recited the gist of her conversation with him about the hospital. Mr. Casaubon did not question her further, but he felt sure that she had wished to know what had passed between Lydgate and himself. "She knows that I know," said the ever restless voice within, but that increase of tacit knowledge only thrust further off any confidence between them. Chapter Roman 45. It is the humor of many heads to extol the days of their forefathers, and declaim against the wickedness of times present, which notwithstanding they cannot handsomely do, without the borrowed help and satire of times past, condemning the vices of their own times, by the expressions of vices in times which they commend, which cannot but argue the community of vice in both. Horace, therefore, Juvenal, and Persis were no prophets, although their lines did seem to indigitate and point at our times. Sir Thomas Browne, Pseudodoxia Epidemica, that opposition to the new fever hospital which Lydgate had sketched to Dorothea was, like other oppositions, to be viewed in many different lights. He regarded it as a mixture of jealousy and dunderheaded prejudice. Mr. Bulstrode saw in it not only medical jealousy but a determination to thwart himself, prompted mainly by a hatred of that vital religion of which he had striven to be an effectual lay representative, a hatred which certainly found pretexts apart from religion such as were only too easy to find in the entanglements of human action. These may be called the ministerial views, but oppositions have the illimitable range of objections at command, which need never stop short at the boundary of knowledge, but can draw forever on the vasts of ignorance. What the opposition in Middlemarch said about the new hospital and its administration had certainly a great deal of echo in it, for heaven has taken care that everybody shall not be an originator. But there were differences which represented every social shade between the polished moderation of Dr. Minchin and the trenchant assertion of Mrs. Dollop, the landlady of the Tankard in Slaughter Lane. Mrs. Dollop became more and more convinced by her own asseveration that Dr. Lydgate meant to let the people die in the hospital, if not to poison them, for the sake of cutting them up without saying by your leave or with your leave, for it was a known fact that he had wanted to cut up Mrs. Goby, as respectable a woman as any in Parley Street, who had money in trust before her marriage, a poor tale for a doctor, who if he was good for anything should know what was the matter with you before you died, and not want to pry into your inside after you were gone. If that was not reason, Mrs. Dollop wished to know what was, but there was a prevalent feeling in her audience that her opinion was a bulwark, and that if it were overthrown there would be no limits to the cutting up of bodies, as had been well seen in Burke and Hare with their pitch plaisters. Such a hanging business as that was not wanted in Middlemarch, and let it not be supposed that opinion at the Tankard in Slaughter Lane was unimportant to the medical profession. That old authentic public house, the original Tankard, known by the name of Dollop's, was the resort of a great benefit club, which had some months before put to the vote whether its long-standing medical man, Dr. Gambit, should not be cashiered in favor of this Dr. Lydgate, who was capable of performing the most astonishing cures and rescuing people altogether given up by other practitioners. But the balance had been turned against Lydgate by two members, who for some private reasons held that this power of resuscitating persons as good as dead was an equivocal recommendation, and may interfere with providential favors. In the course of the year, however, there had been a change in the public sentiment, of which the unanimity at Dollop's was an index. A good deal more than a year ago, before anything was known of Lydgate's skill, the judgments on it had naturally been divided, depending on a sense of likelihood, situated perhaps in the pit of the stomach or in the pineal gland, and differing in its verdicts, but not the less valuable as a guide in the total deficit of evidence. Patients who had chronic diseases or whose lives had long been worn threadbare, like old Featherstone's, had been at once inclined to try him. Also, many who did not like paying their doctor's bills thought agreeably of opening an account with a new doctor and sending for him without stint if the children's temper wanted a dose. Occasions when the old practitioners were often crusty, and all persons thus inclined to employ Lydgate held it likely that he was clever. Some considered that he may do more than others. Where there was liver, at least there would be no harm in getting a few bottles of stuff from him, since if these proved useless it would still be possible to return to the purifying pills, which kept you alive if they did not remove the yellowness. But these were people of minor importance. Good Middlemarch families were of course not going to change their doctor without reason shown, and everybody who had employed Mr. Peacock did not feel obliged to accept a new man merely in the character of his successor, objecting that he was not likely to be equal to Peacock. But Lydgate had not been long in the town before there were particulars enough reported of him to breed much more specific expectations and to intensify differences into partisanship. Some of the particulars being of that impressive order of which the significance is entirely hidden, like a statistical amount without a standard of comparison, but with a note of exclamation at the end. The cubic feet of oxygen yearly swallowed by a full-grown man. What a shudder they may have created in some Middlemarch circles. Oxygen. Nobody knows what that may be. Is it any wonder the cholera has got to Danzig? And yet there are people who say quarantine is no good. One of the facts quickly rumored was that Lydgate did not dispense drugs. This was offensive both to the physicians whose exclusive distinction seemed infringed on, and to the surgeon apothecaries with whom he ranged himself. And only a little while before, they may have counted on having the law on their side against a man who without calling himself a London-made MD dared to ask for pay except as a charge on drugs. But Lydgate had not been experienced enough to foresee that his new course would be evening more offensive to the lady, and to Mr. Momsey, an important grocer in the top market, who, though not one of his patients, questioned him in an affable manner on the subject. He was injudicious enough to give a hasty popular explanation of his reasons, pointing out to Mr. Momsey that it must lower the character of practitioners and be a constant injury to the public if their only mode of getting paid for their work was by their making out long bills for drafts, boluses, and mixtures. It is in that way that hard-working medical men may come to be almost as mischievous as quacks, said Lydgate, rather thoughtlessly. To get their own bread they must overdose the king's lieges, and that's a bad sort of treason, Mr. Momsey undermines the Constitution in a fatal way. Mr. Momsey was not only an overseer, it was about a question of outdoor pay that he was having an interview with Lydgate. He was also asthmatic and had an increasing family. Thus, from a medical point of view, as well as from his own, he was an important man, truly an exceptional grocer, whose hair was arranged in a flame-like pyramid, and whose retail deference was of the cordial, encouraging kind, jocosely complimentary, and with a certain considerate abstinence from letting out the full force of his mind. It was Mr. Momsey's friendly jocoseness in questioning him, which had set the tone of Lydgate's reply. But let the wise be warned against too great readiness at explanation. It multiplies the sources of mistake, lengthening the sum for reckoners sure to go wrong. Lydgate smiled as he ended his speech, putting his foot into the stirrup, and Mr. Momsey laughed more than he would have done if he had known who the king's lieges were, giving his "Good morning, sir, good morning, sir," with the air of one who saw everything clearly enough. But in truth his views were perturbed. For years he had been paying bills with strictly made items, so that for every half-crown and 18 pence he was certain something measurable had been delivered. He had done this with satisfaction, including it among his responsibilities as a husband and father, and regarding a longer bill than usual as a dignity worth mentioning. Moreover, in addition to the massive benefit of the drugs to self and family, he had enjoyed the pleasure of forming an acute judgment as to their immediate effects, so as to give an intelligent statement for the guidance of Mr. Gambit, a practitioner just a little lower in status than Wrench or Toller, and especially esteemed as an accoucher, of whose ability Mr. Momsey had the poorest opinion on all other points, but in doctoring, he was wont to say in an undertone, he placed Gambit above any of them. Here were deeper reasons than the superficial talk of a new man, which appeared still flimsier in the drawing-room over the shop, when they were recited to Mrs. Momsey, a woman accustomed to be made much of as a fertile mother, generally under attendance more or less frequent from Mr. Gambit, and occasionally having attacks which required doctor mention. Does this Mr. Lydgate mean to say there is no use in taking medicine? Said Mrs. Momsey, who was slightly given to drawling. I should like him to tell me how I could bear up at fair time if I didn't take strengthening medicine for a month beforehand. Think of what I have to provide for calling customers, my dear. Here Mrs. Momsey turned to an intimate female friend who sat by, a large veal pie, a stuffed fillet, a round of beef, ham, tongue, etc., etc. But what keeps me up best is the pink mixture, not the brown. I wonder, Mr. Momsey, with your experience, you could have patience to listen. I should have told him at once that I knew a little better than that. No, 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 said Mr. Momsey. I was not going to tell him my opinion. Hear everything and judge for yourself is my motto. But he didn't know who he was talking to. I was not to be turned on his finger. People often pretend to tell me things, when they may as well say, Momsey, you're a fool. But I smile at it. I humor everybody's weak place. If physic had done harm to self and family, I should have found it out by this time. The next day Mr. Gambit was told that Lydgate went about saying physic was of no use. Truly, said he, lifting his eyebrows with cautious surprise. He was a stout husky man with a large ring on his fourth finger. How will he cure his patients, then? That is what I say, returned Mrs. Momsey, who habitually gave weight to her speech by loading her pronouns. Does he suppose that people will pay him only to come and sit with them and go away again? Mrs. Momsey had had a great deal of sitting from Mr. Gambit, including very full accounts of his own habits of body and other affairs, but of course he knew there was no innuendo in her remark, since his spare time and personal narrative had never been charged for. So he replied, humorously, well, Lydgate is a good-looking young fellow, you know. Not one that I would employ, said Mrs. Momsey. Others may do as they please. There for Mr. Gambit could go away from the chief grocer's without fear of rivalry, but not without a sense that Lydgate was one of those hypocrites who try to discredit others by advertising their own honesty, and that it may be worth some people's while to show him up. Mr. Gambit, however, had a satisfactory practice, much pervaded by the smells of retail trading which suggested the reduction of cash payments to a balance, and he did not think it worth his while to show Lydgate up until he knew how. He had not truly great resources of education, and had had to work his own way against a good deal of professional contempt, but he made none the worse a coucher for calling the breathing apparatus lungs. Other medical men felt themselves more capable. Mr. Toller shared the highest practice in the town and belonged to an old Middlemarch family. There were Tollers in the law and everything else above the line of retail trade. Unlike our irascible friend Wrench, he had the easiest way in the world of taking things which may be supposed to annoy him, being a well-bred, quietly facetious man, who kept a good house, was very fond of a little sporting when he could get it, very friendly with Mr. Hawley, and hostile to Mr. Bulstrode. It may seem odd that with such pleasant habits he should have been given to the heroic treatment, bleeding and blistering and starving his patients, with a dispassionate disregard to his personal example, but the incongruity favored the opinion of his ability among his patients, who commonly observed that Mr. Toller had lazy manners, but his treatment was as active as you could desire. No man, said they, carried more seriousness into his profession. He was a little slow in coming, but when he came, he did something. He was a great favorite in his own circle, and whatever he implied to any one's disadvantage told doubly from his careless, ironical tone. He naturally got tired of smiling and saying, "Ah," when he was told that Mr. Peacock's successor did not mean to dispense medicines, and Mr. Hackbutt one day mentioning it over the wine at a dinner party, Mr. Toller said, laughingly, "Dibbits will get rid of his stale drugs, then. I'm fond of little Dibbits. I'm glad he's in luck." "I see your meaning, Toller," said Mr. Hackbutt, "and I am entirely of your opinion. I shall take an opportunity of expressing myself to that effect. A medical man should be responsible for the quality of the drugs consumed by his patients. That is the rationale of the system of charging which has hitherto obtained, and nothing is more offensive than this ostentation of reform, where there is no real amelioration." "Ostentation, Hackbutt," said Mr. Toller, ironically. "I don't see that. A man can't very well be ostentatious of what nobody believes in. There's no reform in the matter. The question is whether the profit on the drugs is paid to the medical man by the druggist or by the patient, and whether there shall be extra pay under the name of attendance." "Ah, to be sure, one of your damned new versions of old humbug," said Mr. Hawley, passing the decanter to Mr. Wrench. Mr. Wrench, generally abstemious, often drank wine rather freely at a party, getting the more irritable in consequence. "As to humbug, Hawley," he said, "that's a word easy to fling about, but what I contend against is the way medical men are fouling their own nest, and setting up a cry about the country as if a general practitioner who dispenses drugs couldn't be a gentleman. I throw back the imputation with scorn. I say, the most ungentlemanly trick a man can be guilty of is to come among the members of his profession with innovations which are a libel on their time-honored procedure. That is my opinion, and I am ready to maintain it against any one who contradicts me." Mr. Wrench's voice had become exceedingly sharp. "I can't oblige you there, Wrench," said Mr. Hawley, thrusting his hands into his trouser pockets. "My dear fellow," said Mr. Toller, striking in pacifically, and looking at Mr. Wrench, "the physicians have their toes trodden on more than we have. If you come to dignity, it is a question for Minchin and Sprague. Does medical jurisprudence provide nothing against these infringements?" said Mr. Hackbutt, with a disinterested desire to offer his lights. "How does the law stand, Hawley?" "Nothing to be done there," said Mr. Hawley. "I looked into it for Sprague. You'd only break your nose against a damned judge's decision. Pooh, no need of law, said Mr. Toller. So far as practice is concerned, the attempt is an absurdity. No patient will like it. Certainly not peacocks, who have been used to depletion. Pass the wine. Mr. Toller's prediction was partly verified. If Mr. and Mrs. Momsey, who had no idea of employing Lydgate, were made uneasy by his supposed declaration against drugs, it was inevitable that those who called him in should watch a little anxiously to see whether he did use all the means he may use. In the case evening, good Mr. Powderell, who in his constant charity of interpretation was inclined to esteem Lydgate the more for what seemed a conscientious pursuit of a better plan, had his mind disturbed with doubts during his wife's attack of erysipelas, and could not abstain from mentioning to Lydgate that Mr. Peacock on a similar occasion had administered a series of boluses, which were not otherwise definable than by their remarkable effect in bringing Mrs. Powderell round before Michaelmas from an illness, which had begun in a remarkably hot August. At last, truly, in the conflict between his desire not to hurt Lydgate and his anxiety that no means should be lacking, he induced his wife privately to take Wijon's purifying pills, an esteemed Middlemarch medicine, which arrested every disease at the fountain by setting to work at once upon the blood. This cooperative measure was not to be mentioned to Lydgate, and Mr. Powderell himself had no certain reliance on it, only hoping that it may be attended with a blessing. But in this doubtful stage of Lydgate's introduction he was helped by what we mortals rashly call good fortune. I suppose no doctor ever came newly to a place without making cures that surprised somebody, cures which may be called fortune's testimonials, and deserve as much credit as the written or printed kind. Various patients got well, while Lydgate was attending them, some evening of dangerous illnesses, and it was remarked that the new doctor with his new ways had at least the merit of bringing people back from the brink of death. The trash talked on such occasions was the more vexatious to Lydgate, because it gave precisely the sort of prestige which an incompetent and unscrupulous man would desire, and was sure to be imputed to him by the simmering dislike of the other medical men as an encouragement on his own part of ignorant puffing. But evening his proud outspokenness was checked by the discernment that it was as useless to fight against the interpretations of ignorance as to whip the fog, and good fortune insisted on using those interpretations. Mrs. Larcher having just become charitably concerned about alarming symptoms in her charwoman, when Dr. Minchin called, asked him to see her then and there, and to give her a certificate for the infirmary, upon which after examination he wrote a statement of the case as one of tumor, and recommended the bare Nancy Nash as an outpatient. Nancy, calling at home on her way to the infirmary, allowed the staymaker and his wife, in whose attic she lodged, to read Dr. Minchin's paper, and by this means became a subject of compassionate conversation in the neighboring shops of Churchyard Lane, as being afflicted with a tumor at first declared to be as large and hard as a duck's egg, but later in the day to be about the size of your fist. Most hearers agreed that it would have to be cut out, but one had known of oil and another of squitchineal as adequate to soften and reduce any lump in the body when taken enough of into the inside, the oil by gradually suppling, the squitchineal by eating away. Meanwhile, when Nancy presented herself at the infirmary, it happened to be one of Lydgate's days there. After questioning and examining her, Lydgate said to the house surgeon in an undertone, "It's not tumor, it's cramp." He ordered her a blister and some steel mixture, and told her to go home and rest, giving her at the same time a note to Mrs. Larcher, who, she said, was her best employer, to testify that she was in need of good food. But by and by Nancy, in her attic, became portentously worse, the supposed tumor having truly given way to the blister, but only wandered to another region with angrier pain. The staymaker's wife went to fetch Lydgate, and he continued for a fortnight to attend Nancy in her own home, until under his treatment she got quite well and went to work again. But the case continued to be described as one of tumor in Churchyard Lane and other streets, by Mrs. Larcher also, for when Lydgate's remarkable cure was mentioned to Dr. Minchin, he naturally did not like to say, the case was not one of tumor, and I was mistaken in describing it as such, but answered, truly, I saw it was a surgical case, not of a fatal kind. He had been inwardly annoyed, however, when he had asked at the infirmary about the woman he had recommended 2 days before, to hear from the house surgeon, a youngster who was not sorry to vex Minchin with impunity, exactly what had occurred. He privately pronounced that it was indecent in a general practitioner to contradict a physician's diagnosis in that open manner, and afterwards agreed with Wrench that Lydgate was disagreeably inattentive to etiquette. Lydgate did not make the affair a ground for valuing himself or very particularly despising Minchin, such rectification of misjudgments often happening among men of equal qualifications. But report took up this amazing case of tumor, not clearly distinguished from cancer, and considered the more awful for being of the wandering sort, till much prejudice against Lydgate's method as to drugs was overcome by the proof of his marvelous skill in the speedy restoration of Nancy Nash after she had been rolling and rolling in agonies from the presence of a tumor both hard and obstinate, but nevertheless compelled to yield. How could Lydgate help himself? It is offensive to tell a lady, when she is expressing her amazement at your skill, that she is altogether mistaken, and rather foolish in her amazement, and to have entered into the nature of diseases would only have added to his breaches of medical propriety. Thus he had to wince under a promise of success given by that ignorant praise which misses every valid quality. In the case of a more conspicuous patient, Mr. Borthrop Trumbull, Lydgate was conscious of having shown himself something better than an everyday doctor, though here too it was an equivocal advantage that he won. The eloquent auctioneer was seized with pneumonia, and having been a patient of Mr. Peacock's, sent for Lydgate, whom he had expressed his intention to patronize. Mr. Trumbull was a robust man, a good subject for trying the expectant theory upon, watching the course of an interesting disease when left as much as possible to itself, so that the stages may be noted for future guidance, and from the air with which he described his sensations Lydgate surmised that he would like to be taken into his medical man's confidence, and be represented as a partner in his own cure. The auctioneer heard, without much surprise, that his was a constitution which always with due watching may be left to itself, so as to offer a beautiful example of a disease with all its phases seen in clear delineation, and that he probably had the rare strength of mind voluntarily to become the test of a rational procedure, and thus make the disorder of his pulmonary functions a general benefit to society. Mr. Trumbull acquiesced at once, and entered strongly into the view that an illness of his was no ordinary occasion for medical science. Never fear, sir. You are not speaking to one who is altogether ignorant of the vis medicatrix, said he, with his usual superiority of expression made rather pathetic by difficulty of breathing, and he went without shrinking through his abstinence from drugs, much sustained by application of the thermometer which implied the importance of his temperature, by the sense that he furnished objects for the microscope, and by learning many new words which seemed suited to the dignity of his secretions, for Lydgate was acute enough to indulge him with a little technical talk. It may be imagined that Mr. Trumbull rose from his couch with a disposition to speak of an illness in which he had manifested the strength of his mind as well as constitution, and he was not backward in awarding credit to the medical man who had discerned the quality of patient he had to deal with. The auctioneer was not an ungenerous man, and liked to give others their due, feeling that he could afford it. He had caught the words, expectant method, and rang chimes on this and other learned phrases to accompany the assurance that Lydgate knew a thing or two more than the rest of the doctors, was far better versed in the secrets of his profession than the majority of his compeers. This had happened before the affair of Fred Vincey's illness had given to Mr. Wrench's enmity towards Lydgate more definite personal ground. The newcomer already threatened to be a nuisance in the shape of rivalry, and was certainly a nuisance in the shape of practical criticism or reflections on his hard-driven elders, who had had something else to do than to busy themselves with untried notions. His practice had spread in 1 or 2 quarters, and from the first the report of his high family had led to his being pretty generally invited, so that the other medical men had to meet him at dinner in the best houses, and having to meet a man whom you dislike is not observed always to end in a mutual attachment. There was hardly ever so much unanimity among them as in the opinion that Lydgate was an arrogant young fellow, and yet ready for the sake of ultimately predominating to show a crawling subservience to Bulstrode. That Mr. Fairbrother, whose name was a chief flag of the anti-Bulstrode party, always defended Lydgate and made a friend of him, was referred to Fairbrother's unaccountable way of fighting on both sides. Here was plenty of preparation for the outburst of professional disgust at the announcement of the laws Mr. Bulstrode was laying down for the direction of the new hospital, which were the more exasperating because there was no present possibility of interfering with his will and pleasure, everybody except Lord Medlicote having refused help towards the building, on the ground that they preferred giving to the old infirmary. Mr. Bulstrode met all the expenses, and had ceased to be sorry that he was purchasing the right to carry out his notions of improvement without hindrance from prejudiced cogitors, but he had had to spend large sums, and the building had lingered. Caleb Garth had undertaken it, had failed during its progress, and before the interior fittings were begun had retired from the management of the business, and when referring to the hospital he often said that however Bulstrode may ring if you tried him, he liked good solid carpentry and masonry, and had a notion both of drains and chimneys. In fact, the hospital had become an object of intense interest to Bulstrode, and he would willingly have continued to spare a large yearly sum that he may rule it dictatorially without any board. But he had another favorite object which also required money for its accomplishment. He wished to buy some land in the neighborhood of Middlemarch, and therefore he wished to get considerable contributions towards maintaining the hospital. Meanwhile he framed his plan of management. The hospital was to be reserved for fever in all its forms. Lydgate was to be chief medical superintendent, that he may have free authority to pursue all comparative investigations which his studies, particularly in Paris, had shown him the importance of, the other medical visitors having a consultative influence, but no power to contravene Lydgate's ultimate decisions, and the general management was to be lodged exclusively in the hands of 5 directors associated with Mr. Bulstrode, who were to have votes in the ratio of their contributions, the board itself filling up any vacancy in its numbers, and no mob of small contributors being admitted to a share of government. There was an immediate refusal on the part of every medical man in the town to become a visitor at the fever hospital. "Very well," said Lydgate to Mr. Bulstrode, "we have a capital house surgeon and dispenser, a clear-headed, neat-handed fellow. We'll get Webb from Crabsley, as good a country practitioner as any of them, to come over twice a week, and in case of any exceptional operation, Prothero will come from Brassing. I must work the harder, that's all, and I have given up my post at the infirmary. The plan will flourish in spite of them, and then they'll be glad to come in. Things can't last as they are. There must be all sorts of reform soon, and then young fellows may be glad to come and study here." Lydgate was in high spirits. "I shall not flinch, you may depend upon it, Mr. Lydgate," said Mr. Bulstrode. "While I see you carrying out high intentions with vigor, you shall have my unfailing support, and I have humble confidence that the blessing which has hitherto attended my efforts against the spirit of evil in this town will not be withdrawn. Suitable directors to assist me I have no doubt of securing. Mr. Brooke of Tipton has already given me his concurrence, and a pledge to contribute yearly. He has not specified the sum, probably not a great one, but he will be a useful member of the board." A useful member was perhaps to be defined as one who would originate nothing and always vote with Mr. Bulstrode. The medical aversion to Lydgate was hardly disguised now. Neither Dr. Sprague nor Dr. Minchin said that he disliked Lydgate's knowledge or his disposition to improve treatment. What they disliked was his arrogance, which nobody felt to be altogether deniable. They implied that he was insolent, pretentious, and given to that reckless innovation for the sake of noise and show which was the essence of the charlatan. The word charlatan once thrown on the air could not be let drop. In those days the world was agitated about the wondrous doings of Mr. St. John Long, noblemen and gentlemen, attesting his extraction of a fluid like mercury from the temples of a patient. Mr. Toller remarked one day, smilingly, to Mrs. Taft, that Bulstrode had found a man to suit him in Lydgate. A charlatan in religion is sure to like other sorts of charlatans. Yes, truly, I can imagine, said Mrs. Taft, keeping the number of 30 stitches carefully in her mind all the while. There are so many of that sort. I remember Mr. Cheshire, with his irons, trying to make people straight when the Almighty had made them crooked. No, no, said Mr. Toller, Cheshire was all right, all fair and above board. But there's St. John Long, that's the kind of fellow we call a charlatan, advertising cures in ways nobody knows anything about, a fellow who wants to make a noise by pretending to go deeper than other people. The other day he was pretending to tap a man's brain and get quicksilver out of it. Good gracious, what dreadful trifling with people's constitutions, said Mrs. Taft. After this, it came to be held in various quarters that Lydgate played evening with respectable constitutions for his own purposes, and how much more likely that in his flighty experimenting he should make sixes and sevens of hospital patients. Especially it was to be expected, as the landlady of the Tankard had said, that he would recklessly cut up their dead bodies. For Lydgate, having attended Mrs. Goby, who died apparently of a heart disease not very clearly expressed in the symptoms, too daringly asked leave of her relatives to open the body, and thus gave an offence quickly spreading beyond Parley Street, where that lady had long resided on an income such as made this association of her body with the victims of Burke and Hare a flagrant insult to her memory. Affairs were in this stage when Lydgate opened the subject of the hospital to Dorothea. We see that he was bearing enmity and silly misconception with much spirit, aware that they were partly created by his good share of success. They will not drive me away, he said, talking confidentially in Mr. Fairbrother's study. I have got a good opportunity here for the ends I care most about, and I am pretty sure to get income enough for our wants. By and by I shall go on as quietly as possible. I have no seductions now away from home and work, and I am more and more convinced that it will be possible to demonstrate the homogeneous origin of all the tissues. Raspail and others are on the same track, and I have been losing time. I have no power of prophecy there, said Mr. Fairbrother, who had been puffing at his pipe thoughtfully while Lydgate talked. But as to the hostility in the town, you'll weather it if you are prudent. How am I to be prudent? Said Lydgate. I just do what comes before me to do. I can't help people's ignorance and spite, any more than Vesalius could. It isn't possible to square one's conduct to silly conclusions which nobody can foresee. Quite true. I didn't mean that. I meant only two things. One is, keep yourself as separable from Bulstrode as you can. Of course, you can go on doing good work of your own by his help, but don't get tied. Perhaps it seems like personal feeling in me to say so, and there's a good deal of that, I own. But personal feeling is not always in the wrong if you boil it down to the impressions which make it simply an opinion. Bulstrode is nothing to me, said Lydgate, carelessly, except on public grounds. As to getting very closely united to him, I am not fond enough of him for that. But what was the other thing you meant? Said Lydgate, who was nursing his leg as comfortably as possible and feeling in no great need of advice. Why, this. Take care, experto creed, take care not to get hampered about money matters. I know, by a word you let fall one day, that you don't like my playing at cards so much for money. You are right enough there, but try and keep clear of wanting small sums that you haven't got. I am perhaps talking rather superfluously, but a man likes to assume superiority over himself by holding up his bad example and sermonizing on it. Lydgate took Mr. Fairbrother's hints very cordially, though he would hardly have borne them from another man. He could not help remembering that he had lately made some debts, but these had seemed inevitable, and he had no intention now to do more than keep house in a simple way. The furniture for which he owed would not want renewing, nor evening the stock of wine for a long while. Many thoughts cheered him at that time, and justly. A man conscious of enthusiasm for worthy aims is sustained under petty hostilities by the memory of great workers who had to fight their way not without wounds, and who hover in his mind as patron saints, invisibly helping. At home, that same evening when he had been chatting with Mr. Fairbrother, he had his long legs stretched on the sofa, his head thrown back, and his hands clasped behind it according to his favorite ruminating attitude, while Rosamond sat at the piano and played one tune after another, of which her husband only knew, like the emotional elephant he was, that they fell in with his mood as if they had been melodious sea breezes. There was something very fine in Lydgate's look just then, and any one may have been encouraged to bet on his achievement. In his dark eyes and on his mouth and brow there was that placidity which comes from the fullness of contemplative thought, the mind not searching, but beholding, and the glance seeming to be filled with what is behind it. Soon Rosamond left the piano, and seated herself on a chair close to the sofa and opposite her husband's face. "Is that enough music for you, my lord?" she said, folding her hands before her and putting on a little air of meekness. "Yes, dear, if you are tired," said Lydgate, gently, turning his eyes and resting them on her, but not otherwise moving. Rosamond's presence at that moment was perhaps no more than a spoonful brought to the lake, and her woman's instinct in this matter was not dull. "What is absorbing you?" she said, leaning forward and bringing her face near to his. He moved his hands and placed them gently behind her shoulders. "I am thinking of a great fellow who was about as old as I am 300 years ago, and had already begun a new era in anatomy." "I can't guess," said Rosamond, shaking her head. "We used to play at guessing historical characters at Mrs. Lemon's, but not anatomists. I'll tell you. His name was Vesalius, and the only way he could get to know anatomy as he did was by going to snatch bodies at night from graveyards and places of execution." "Oh," said Rosamond, with a look of disgust on her pretty face, "I am very glad you are not Vesalius. I should have thought he may find some less horrible way than that." "No, he couldn't," said Lydgate, going on too earnestly to take much notice of her answer. "He could only get a complete skeleton by snatching the whitened bones of a criminal from the gallows, and burying them, and fetching them away by bits secretly, in the dead of night." "I hope he is not one of your great heroes," said Rosamond, half playfully, half anxiously, "else I shall have you getting up in the night to go to St. Peter's churchyard. You know how angry you told me the people were about Mrs. Bobby. You have enemies enough already. So had Vesalius, Rosie. No wonder the medical fogies in Middlemarch are jealous, when some of the greatest doctors living were fierce upon Vesalius because they had believed in Galen, and he showed that Galen was wrong. They called him a liar and a poisonous monster, but the facts of the human frame were on his side, and so he got the better of them." "And what happened to him afterwards?" said Rosamond, with some interest. "Oh, he had a good deal of fighting to the last, and they did exasperate him enough at one time to make him burn a good deal of his work. Then he got shipwrecked just as he was coming from Jerusalem to take a great chair at Padua. He died rather miserably." There was a moment's pause before Rosamond said, "Do you know, Tertius, I often wish you had not been a medical man." "No, Rosie, don't say that," said Lydgate, drawing her closer to him. "That is like saying you wish you had married another man." "Not at all. You are clever enough for anything. You may easily have been something else. And your cousins at Quallingham all think that you have sunk below them in your choice of a profession." "The cousins at Quallingham may go to the devil," said Lydgate, with scorn. "It was like their impudence if they said anything of the sort to you." "Still," said Rosamond, "I do not think it is a nice profession, dear." We know that she had much quiet perseverance in her opinion. "It is the grandest profession in the world, Rosamond," said Lydgate, gravely, "and to say that you love me without loving the medical man in me is the same sort of thing as to say that you like eating a peach but don't like its flavor." Chapter Roman 46. Pius no podemos haber aquello que querimos, queremos aquello que pedimos. Since we cannot get what we like, let us like what we can get. Spanish proverb. While Lydgate, safely married and with a hospital under his command, felt himself struggling for medical reform against Middlemarch, Middlemarch was becoming more and more conscious of the national struggle for another kind of reform. By the time that Lord John Russell's measure was being debated in the House of Commons, there was a new political animation in Middlemarch, and a new definition of parties which may show a decided change of balance if a new election came. And there were some who already predicted this event, declaring that a reform bill would never be carried by the actual Parliament. This was what Will Ladislaw dwelt on to Mr. Brooke as a reason for congratulation that he had not yet tried his strength at the hustings. Things will grow and ripen as if it were a comet year, said Will. The public temper will soon get to a cometary heat. Now the question of reform has set in. There is likely to be another election before long, and by that time Middlemarch will have got more ideas into its head. What we have to work at now is the pioneer and political meetings. Quite right, Ladislaw. We shall make a new thing of opinion here, said Mr. Brooke. Only I want to keep myself independent about reform, you know. I don't want to go too far. I want to take up Wilberforce's and Romilly's line, you know, and work at Negro emancipation, criminal law, that kind of thing. But of course I should support Gray. If you go in for the principle of reform, you must be prepared to take what the situation offers, said Will. If everybody pulled for his own bit against everybody else, the whole question would go to tatters. Yes, I agree with you. I quite take that point of view. I should put it in that light. I should support Gray, you know, but I don't want to change the balance of the Constitution, and I don't think Gray would. But that is what the country wants, said Will. Else there would be no meaning in political unions or any other movement that knows what it's about. It wants to have a House of Commons which is not weighted with nominees of the landed class, but with representatives of the other interests. And as to contending for a reform short of that, it is like asking for a bit of an avalanche which has already begun to thunder. That is fine, Ladislaw. That is the way to put it. Write that down, now. We must begin to get documents about the feeling of the country, as well as the machine breaking and general distress. As to documents, said Will, a 2-inch card will hold plenty. A few rows of figures are enough to deduce misery from, and a few more will show the rate at which the political determination of the people is growing. Good, draw that out a little more at length, Ladislaw. That is an idea, now. Write it out in the Pioneer. Put the figures and deduce the misery, you know, and put the other figures and deduce, and so on. You have a way of putting things. Burke, now. When I think of Burke, I can't help wishing somebody had a pocket borough to give you, Ladislaw. You'd never get elected, you know, and we shall always want talent in the House. Reform as we will, we shall always want talent. That avalanche and the thunder, now, was really a little like Burke. I want that sort of thing, not ideas, you know, but a way of putting them. Pocket boroughs would be a fine thing, said Ladislaw, if they were always in the right pocket, and there were always a Burke at hand. Will was not displeased with that complimentary comparison, evening from Mr. Brooke, for it is a little too trying to human flesh to be conscious of expressing one's self better than others and never to have it noticed, and in the general dearth of admiration for the right thing, evening a chance bray of applause falling exactly in time is rather fortifying. Will felt that his literary refinements were usually beyond the limits of Middlemarch perception. Nevertheless, he was beginning thoroughly to like the work of which when he began he had said to himself rather languidly, "Why not?" And he studied the political situation with as ardent an interest as he had ever given to poetic meters or medievalism. It is undeniable that but for the desire to be where Dorothea was, and perhaps the want of knowing what else to do, Will would not at this time have been meditating on the needs of the English people or criticizing English statesmanship. He would probably have been rambling in Italy sketching plans for several dramas, trying prose and finding it too jejun, trying verse and finding it too artificial, beginning to copy bits from old pictures, leaving off because they were no good, and observing that, after all, self-culture was the principal point, while in politics he would have been sympathizing warmly with liberty and progress in general. Our sense of duty must often wait for some work which shall take the place of dilettantism, and make us feel that the quality of our action is not a matter of indifference. Ladislaw had now accepted his bit of work, though it was not that indeterminate loftiest thing which he had once dreamed of as alone worthy of continuous effort. His nature warmed easily in the presence of subjects which were visibly mixed with life and action, and the easily stirred rebellion in him helped the glow of public spirit. In spite of Mr. Casaubon and the banishment from Lowick, he was rather happy, getting a great deal of fresh knowledge in a vivid way and for practical purposes, and making the Pioneer celebrated as far as Brassing. Never mind the smallness of the area. The writing was not worse than much that reaches the four corners of the earth. Mr. Brooke was occasionally irritating, but Will's impatience was relieved by the division of his time between visits to the Grange and retreats to his Middlemarch lodgings, which gave variety to his life. Shift the pegs a little, he said to himself, and Mr. Brooke may be in the cabinet while I was under secretary. That is the common order of things. The little waves make the large ones and are of the same pattern. I am better here than in the sort of life Mr. Casaubon would have trained me for, where the doing would be all laid down by a precedent too rigid for me to react upon. I don't care for prestige or high pay. As Lydgate had said of him, he was a sort of gypsy, rather enjoying the sense of belonging to no class. He had a feeling of romance in his position, and a pleasant consciousness of creating a little surprise wherever he went. That sort of enjoyment had been disturbed when he had felt some new distance between himself and Dorothea in their accidental meeting at Lydgate's, and his irritation had gone out towards Mr. Casaubon, who had declared beforehand that Will would lose caste. I never had any caste, he would have said, if that prophecy had been uttered to him, and the quick blood would have come and gone like breath in his transparent skin. But it is one thing to like defiance, and another thing to like its consequences. Meanwhile, the town opinion about the new editor of the Pioneer was tending to confirm Mr. Casaubon's view. Will's relationship in that distinguished quarter did not, like Lydgate's high connections, serve as an advantageous introduction. If it was rumored that young Ladislaw was Mr. Casaubon's nephew or cousin, it was also rumored that Mr. Casaubon would have nothing to do with him. Brooke has taken him up, said Mr. Hawley, because that is what no man in his senses could have expected. Casaubon has devilish good reasons, you may be sure, for turning the cold shoulder on a young fellow whose bringing up he paid for. Just like Brooke, one of those fellows who would praise a cat to sell a horse. And some oddities of Will's, more or less poetical, appeared to support Mr. Tech, the editor of the Trumpet, in asserting that Ladislaw, if the truth were known, was not only a Polish emissary but crack-brain, which accounted for the preternatural quickness and glibness of his speech when he got onto a platform, as he did whenever he had an opportunity, speaking with a facility which cast reflections on solid Englishmen generally. It was disgusting to Keck to see a strip of a fellow, with light curls round his head, get up and speechify by the hour against institutions which had existed when he was in his cradle, and in a leading article of the Trumpet, Keck characterized Ladislaw's speech at a reform meeting as the violence of an energumen, a miserable effort to shroud in the brilliancy of fireworks the daring of irresponsible statements and the poverty of a knowledge which was of the cheapest and most recent description. That was a rattling article yesterday, Keck, said Dr. Sprague, with sarcastic intentions. But what is an energumen? Oh, a term that came up in the French Revolution, said Keck. This dangerous aspect of Ladislaw was strangely contrasted with other habits, which became matter of remark. He had a fondness, half artistic, half affectionate, for little children. The smaller they were on tolerably active legs, and the funnier their clothing, the better Will liked to surprise and please them. We know that in Rome he was given to ramble about among the poor people, and the taste did not quit him in Middlemarch. He had somehow picked up a troop of droll children, little hatless boys with their galligaskins much worn and scant shirting to hang out, little girls who tossed their hair out of their eyes to look at him, and guardian brothers at the mature age of 7. This troop he had led out on gypsy excursions to Halsell Wood at nutting time, and since the cold weather had set in he had taken them on a clear day to gather sticks for a bonfire in the hollow of a hillside, where he drew out a small feast of gingerbread for them, and improvised a Punch and Judy drama with some private homemade puppets. Here was one oddity. Another was that in houses where he got friendly, he was given to stretch himself at full length on the rug while he talked, and was apt to be discovered in this attitude by occasional callers for whom such an irregularity was likely to confirm the notions of his dangerously mixed blood and general laxity. But Will's articles and speeches naturally recommended him in families, which the new strictness of party division had marked off on the side of reform. He was invited to Mr. Bulstrode's, but here he could not lie down on the rug, and Mrs. Bulstrode felt that his mode of talking about Catholic countries, as if there were any truce with Antichrist, illustrated the usual tendency to unsoundness in intellectual men. At Mr. Fairbrother's, however, whom the irony of events had brought on the same side with Bulstrode in the national movement, Will became a favorite with the ladies, especially with little Miss Noble, whom it was one of his oddities to escort when he met her in the street with her little basket, giving her his arm in the eyes of the town, and insisting on going with her to pay some call where she distributed her small filchings from her own share of sweet things. But the house where he visited oftenest and lay most on the rug was Lydgate's. The two men were not at all alike, but they agreed none the worse. Lydgate was abrupt but not irritable, taking little notice of megrims in healthy people, and Ladislaw did not usually throw away his susceptibilities on those who took no notice of them. With Rosamond, on the other hand, he pouted and was wayward, no, often uncomplimentary, much to her inward surprise. Nevertheless, he was gradually becoming necessary to her entertainment by his companionship in her music, his varied talk, and his freedom from the grave preoccupation which, with all her husband's tenderness and indulgence, often made his manners unsatisfactory to her, and confirmed her dislike of the medical profession. Lydgate, inclined to be sarcastic on the superstitious faith of the people in the efficacy of the bill, while nobody cared about the low state of pathology, sometimes assailed Will with troublesome questions. One evening in March, Rosamond in her cherry-colored dress with swansdown trimming about the throat sat at the tea-table. Lydgate, lately come and tired from his outdoor work, was seated sideways on an easy chair by the fire with one leg over the elbow, his brow looking a little troubled as his eyes rambled over the columns of a Pioneer, while Rosamond, having noticed that he was perturbed, avoided looking at him, and inwardly thanked heaven that she herself had not a moody disposition. Will Ladislaw was stretched on the rug contemplating the curtain pole abstractedly, and humming very low the notes of When First I Saw Your Face, while the house spaniel, also stretched out with small choice of room, looked from between his paws at the usurper of the rug with silent but strong objection. Rosamond bringing Lydgate his cup of tea, he threw down the paper, and said to Will, who had started up and gone to the table, "It's no use your puffing Brooke as a reforming landlord, Ladislaw. They only pick the more holes in his coat in the Trumpet." "No matter. Those who read the Pioneer don't read the Trumpet," said Will, swallowing his tea and walking about. "Do you suppose the public reads with a view to its own conversion? We should have a witches brewing with a vengeance then. Mingle, 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 you that mingle may, and nobody would know which side he was going to take. Fairbrother says he doesn't believe Brooke would get elected if the opportunity came. The very men who profess to be for him would bring another member out of the bag at the right moment. There's no harm in trying. It's good to have resident members." "Why," said Lydgate, who was much given to use that inconvenient word in a curt tone, "they represent the local stupidity better," said Will, laughing and shaking his curls, "and they are kept on their best behavior in the neighborhood. Brooke is not a bad fellow, but he has done some good things on his estate that he never would have done but for this parliamentary bite. He's not fitted to be a public man," said Lydgate, with contemptuous decision. "He would disappoint everybody who counted on him." I can see that at the hospital. Only, their Bulstrode holds the reins and drives him. That depends on how you fix your standard of public men, said Will. He's good enough for the occasion. When the people have made up their mind as they are making it up now, they don't want a man, they only want a vote. That is the way with you political writers. Ladislaw, crying up a measure as if it were a universal cure, and crying up men who are a part of the very disease that wants curing. Why not? Men may help to cure themselves off the face of the land without knowing it, said Will, who could find reasons impromptu when he had not thought of a question beforehand. That is no excuse for encouraging the superstitious exaggeration of hopes about this particular measure, helping the cry to swallow it whole and to send up voting popinjays who are good for nothing but to carry it. You go against rottenness. And there is nothing more thoroughly rotten than making people believe that society can be cured by a political hocus-pocus. That's very fine, my dear fellow, but your cure must begin somewhere, and put it that 1,000 things which debase a population can never be reformed without this particular reform to begin with. Look what Stanley said the other day, that the House had been tinkering long enough at small questions of bribery, inquiring whether this or that voter has had a guinea when everybody knows that the seats have been sold wholesale. Wait for wisdom and conscience in public agents, fiddlestick. The only conscience we can trust to is the massive sense of wrong in a class, and the best wisdom that will work is the wisdom of balancing claims. That's my text. Which side is injured? I support the man who supports their claims, not the virtuous upholder of the wrong. That general talk about a particular case is mere question begging, Ladislaw. When I say, I go in for the dose that cures, it doesn't follow that I go in for opium in a given case of gout. I am not begging the question we are upon, whether we are to try for nothing till we find immaculate men to work with. Should you go on that plan? If there were one man who would carry you a medical reform and another who would oppose it, should you inquire which had the better motives or evening the better brains? Oh, of course, said Lydgate, seeing himself checkmated by a move which he had often used himself. If one did not work with such men as are at hand, things must come to a deadlock. Suppose the worst opinion in the town about Bulstrode were a true one. That would not make it less true that he has the sense and the resolution to do what I think ought to be done in the matters I know and care most about, but that is the only ground on which I go with him. Lydgate added rather proudly, bearing in mind Mr. Fairbrother's remarks, he is nothing to me otherwise. I would not cry him up on any personal ground. I would keep clear of that. Do you mean that I cried up Brooke on any personal ground? Said Ladislaw, nettled, and turning sharp round. For the first time he felt offended with Lydgate, not the less so, perhaps, because he would have declined any close inquiry into the growth of his relation to Mr. Brooke. Not at all, said Lydgate. I was simply explaining my own action. I meant that a man may work for a special end with others whose motives and general course are equivocal, if he is quite sure of his personal independence, and that he is not working for his private interest, either place or money. Then, why don't you extend your liberality to others? Said Will, still nettled. My personal independence is as important to me as yours is to you. You have no more reason to imagine that I have personal expectations from Brooke than I have to imagine that you have personal expectations from Bulstrode. Motives are points of honor, I suppose. Nobody can prove them. But as to money and place in the world, Will ended, tossing back his head, I think it is pretty clear that I am not determined by considerations of that sort. You quite mistake me, Ladislaw, said Lydgate, surprised. He had been preoccupied with his own vindication, and had been blind to what Ladislaw may infer on his own account. I beg your pardon for unintentionally annoying you. In fact, I should rather attribute to you a romantic disregard of your own worldly interests. On the political question, I referred simply to intellectual bias. How very unpleasant you both are this evening, said Rosamond. I cannot conceive why money should have been referred to. Politics and medicine are sufficiently disagreeable to quarrel upon. You can both of you go on quarreling with all the world and with each other on those two topics. Rosamond looked mildly neutral as she said this, rising to ring the bell, and then crossing to her work table. "Poor Rosie," said Lydgate, putting out his hand to her as she was passing him. "Disputation is not amusing to cherubs. Have some music. Ask Ladislaw to sing with you." When Will was gone, Rosamond said to her husband, "What put you out of temper this evening, Tertius?" "Me." It was Ladislaw who was out of temper. "He is like a bit of tinder. But I mean, before that, something had vexed you before you came in. You looked cross, and that made you begin to dispute with Mr. Ladislaw. You hurt me very much when you look so, Tertius." "Do I? Then I am a brute," said Lydgate, caressing her penitently. "What vexed you? Oh, outdoor things, business." It was really a letter insisting on the payment of a bill for furniture. Chapter Roman 47. Was never true love loved in vain, for truest love is highest gain. No art can make it, it must spring where elements are fostering. So in heaven's spot and hour springs the little native flower, downward root and upward eye, shapen by the earth and sky. It happened to be on a Saturday evening that Ladislaw had that little discussion with Lydgate. Its effect when he went to his own rooms was to make him sit up half the night, thinking over again, under a new irritation, all that he had before thought of his having settled in Middlemarch and harnessed himself with Mr. Brooke. Hesitations before he had taken the step had, since turned into susceptibility to every hint that he would have been wiser not to take it, and therefore came his heat towards Lydgate, a heat which still kept him restless. Was he not making a fool of himself? And at a time when he was more than ever conscious of being something better than a fool. And for what end? Well, for no definite end. True, he had dreamy visions of possibilities. There is no human being who, having both passions and thoughts, does not think in consequence of his passions, does not find images rising in his mind which soothe the passion with hope or sting it with dread. But this, which happens to us all, happens to some with a wide difference, and Will was not one of those whose wit keeps the roadway. He had his bypaths where there were little joys of his own choosing, such as gentlemen cantering on the highroad may have thought rather idiotic. The way in which he made a sort of happiness for himself out of his feeling for Dorothea was an example of this. It may seem strange, but it is the fact that the ordinary vulgar vision of which Mr. Casaubon suspected him, namely, that Dorothea may become a widow, and that the interest he had established in her mind may turn into acceptance of him as a husband, had no tempting, arresting power over him. He did not live in the scenery of such an event, and follow it out, as we all do with that imagined, otherwise, which is our practical heaven. It was not only that he was unwilling to entertain thoughts which could be accused of baseness, and was already uneasy in the sense that he had to justify himself from the charge of ingratitude. The latent consciousness of many other barriers between himself and Dorothea besides the existence of her husband had helped to turn away his imagination from speculating on what may befall Mr. Casaubon. And there were yet other reasons. Will, we know, could not bear the thought of any flaw appearing in his crystal. He was at once exasperated and delighted by the calm freedom with which Dorothea looked at him and spoke to him, and there was something so exquisite in thinking of her just as she was, that he could not long for a change which must somehow change her. Do we not shun the street version of a fine melody, or shrink from the news that the rarity, some bit of chiseling or engraving perhaps, which we have dwelt on evening with exultation in the trouble it has cost us to snatch glimpses of it, is really not an uncommon thing, and may be obtained as an everyday possession? Our good depends on the quality and breadth of our emotion, and to Will, a creature who cared little for what are called the solid things of life and greatly for its subtler influences, to have within him such a feeling as he had towards Dorothea was like the inheritance of a fortune. What others may have called the futility of his passion made an additional delight for his imagination. He was conscious of a generous movement, and of verifying in his own experience that higher love poetry which had charmed his fancy. Dorothea, he said to himself, was forever enthroned in his soul. No other woman could sit higher than her footstool, and if he could have written out in immortal syllables the effect she wrought within him, he may have boasted after the example of old Drayton, that, queens hereafter may be glad to live upon the alms of her superfluous praise. But this result was questionable, and what else could he do for Dorothea? What was his devotion worth to her? It was impossible to tell. He would not go out of her reach. He saw no creature among her friends to whom he could believe that she spoke with the same simple confidence as to him. She had once said that she would like him to stay, and stay he would, whatever fire-breathing dreadens may hiss around her. This had always been the conclusion of Will's hesitations, but he was not without contradictoriness and rebellion evening towards his own resolve. He had often got irritated, as he was on this particular night, by some outside demonstration that his public exertions with Mr. Brooke as a chief could not seem as heroic as he would like them to be, and this was always associated with the other ground of irritation, that notwithstanding his sacrifice of dignity for Dorothea's sake, he could hardly ever see her, upon which, not being able to contradict these unpleasant facts, he contradicted his own strongest bias and said, "I am a fool." Nevertheless, since the inward debate necessarily turned on Dorothea, he ended, as he had done before, only by getting a livelier sense of what her presence would be to him, and suddenly reflecting that the tomorrow would be Sunday, he determined to go to Lowick Church and see her. He slept upon that idea, but when he was dressing in the rational morning light, objection said, "That will be a virtual defiance of Mr. Casaubon's prohibition to visit Lowick, and Dorothea will be displeased." "Nonsense," argued inclination. "It would be too monstrous for him to hinder me from going out to a pretty country church on a spring morning, and Dorothea will be glad. It will be clear to Mr. Casaubon that you have come either to annoy him or to see Dorothea." "It is not true that I go to annoy him, and why should I not go to see Dorothea? Is he to have everything to himself and be always comfortable? Let him smart a little, as other people are obliged to do. I have always liked the quaintness of the church and congregation. Besides, I know the Tuckers. I shall go into their pew." Having silenced objection by force of unreason, Will walked to Lowick as if he had been on the way to Paradise, crossing Housel Common and skirting the wood, where the sunlight fell broadly under the budding boughs, bringing out the beauties of moss and lichen and fresh green growths piercing the brown. Everything seemed to know that it was Sunday and to approve of his going to Lowick Church. Will easily felt happy when nothing crossed his humor, and by this time the thought of vexing Mr. Casaubon had become rather amusing to him, making his face break into its merry smile, pleasant to see as the breaking of sunshine on the water, though the occasion was not exemplary. But most of us are apt to settle within ourselves that the man who blocks our way is odious, and not to mind causing him a little of the disgust which his personality excites in ourselves. Will went along with a small book under his arm and a hand in each side pocket, never reading, but chanting a little, as he made scenes of what would happen in church and coming out. He was experimenting in tunes to suit some words of his own, sometimes trying a ready-made melody, sometimes improvising. The words were not exactly a hymn, but they certainly fitted his Sunday experience. Oh me, what frugal cheer my love does feed upon, a touch, a ray that is not here, a shadow that is gone, a dream of breath that may be near, an inly echoed tone, the thought that one may think me dear, the place where one was known, the tremor of a banished fear, an ill that was not done. Oh me, what frugal cheer my love does feed upon." Sometimes, when he took off his hat, shaking his head backward, and showing his delicate throat as he sang, he looked like an incarnation of the spring whose spirit filled the air, a bright creature, abundant in uncertain promises. The bells were still ringing when he got to Lowick, and he went into the curate's pew before any one else arrived there, but he was still left alone in it when the congregation had assembled. The curate's pew was opposite the rector's at the entrance of the small chancel, and Will had time to fear that Dorothea may not come while he looked round at the group of rural faces which made the congregation from year to year within the whitewashed walls and dark old pews, hardly with more change than we see in the boughs of a tree which breaks here and there with age, but yet has young shoots. Mr. Riggs's frog face was something alien and unaccountable, but notwithstanding this shock to the order of things, there were still the walls and the rural stock of the Powderells in their pews side by side. Brother Samuel's cheek had the same purple round as ever, and the 3 generations of decent cottagers came as of old with a sense of duty to their betters generally, the smaller children regarding Mr. Casaubon, who wore the black gown and mounted to the highest box, as probably the chief of all betters, and the one most awful if offended evening in 1831 Lowick was at peace, not more agitated by reform than by the solemn tenor of the Sunday sermon. The congregation had been used to seeing Will at church in former days, and no one took much note of him except the choir, who expected him to make a figure in the singing. Dorothea did at last appear on this quaint background, walking up the short aisle in her white beaver bonnet and grey cloak, the same she had worn in the Vatican, her face being, from her entrance, towards the chancel. Evening her short-sighted eyes soon discerned Will, but there was no outward show of her feeling except a slight paleness and a grave bow as she passed him. To his own surprise, Will felt suddenly uncomfortable, and dared not look at her after they had bowed to each other. 2 minutes later, when Mr. Casaubon came out of the vestry, and, entering the pew, seated himself in face of Dorothea, Will felt his paralysis more complete. He could look nowhere except at the choir in the little gallery over the vestry door. Dorothea was perhaps pained, and he had made a wretched blunder. It was no longer amusing to vex Mr. Casaubon, who had the advantage probably of watching him and seeing that he dared not turn his head. Why had he not imagined this beforehand? But he could not expect that he should sit in that square pew alone, unrelieved by any Tuckers, who had apparently departed from Lowick altogether, for a new clergyman was in the desk. Still he called himself stupid now for not foreseeing that it would be impossible for him to look towards Dorothea, no, that she may feel his coming an impertinence. There was no delivering himself from his cage, however, and Will found his places and looked at his book as if he had been a schoolmistress, feeling that the morning service had never been so immeasurably long before, that he was utterly ridiculous, out of temper, and miserable. This was what a man got by worshipping the sight of a woman. The clerk observed with surprise that Mr. Ladislaw did not join in the tune of Hanover, and reflected that he may have a cold. Mr. Casaubon did not preach that morning, and there was no change in Will's situation until the blessing had been pronounced, and every one rose. It was the fashion at Lowick for the betters to go out first. With a sudden determination to break the spell that was upon him, Will looked straight at Mr. Casaubon, but that gentleman's eyes were on the button of the pew door, which he opened, allowing Dorothea to pass, and following her immediately without raising his eyelids. Will's glance had caught Dorothea's as she turned out of the pew, and again she bowed, but this time with a look of agitation, as if she were repressing tears. Will walked out after them, but they went on towards the little gate leading out of the churchyard into the shrubbery, never looking round. It was impossible for him to follow them, and he could only walk back sadly at a midday along the same road which he had trodden hopefully in the morning.